Broadband 2. Nonfiction books, all weekend, every weekend.
Now a hearing on Internet services and government regulation. Wednesday, representatives from America Online, GTE Corporation, AT&T, and Time Warner spoke before a House Judiciary Committee about proposed legislation to regulate the Internet. This 3-hour hearing begins with remarks by Committee Chairman Henry Hyde.
Committee will come to order. Today, the committee holds a hearing on H.R. 1686, the Internet Freedom Act, introduced by Congressman Goodlatte, and H.R. 1685, the Internet Growth and Development Act of 1999, introduced by Congressman Boucher. These two bills seek to enhance the growth of the Internet. They involve two related issues. The first has to do with cable broadband lines and whether their owners will be required to grant access to them on non-discriminatory terms. The second is whether the regional Bell operating companies will be able to transport data over long-distance lines within their regions, something they are currently prohibited from doing. The resolution of both of these issues will have profound consequences for the future of the Internet and, more broadly, the ways that we will communicate in the future. This committee has a long and proud history in shaping telecommunications policy, and we were instrumental in passing the landmark Telecommunications Act of 1996 into law. We intend to continue that tradition in our consideration of this legislation. We are the committee responsible for competition policy throughout the economy, and I can't think of a set of competition issues that's more vital to our nation's future. At the time that we were considering the 1996 Act, the Internet was in its infancy. In a little over 3 years, it has gone from a technological marvel to a near necessity for millions of Americans. That tremendous growth has dramatically changed many of the assumptions we held when we were considering the Act. That may mean that we need to reopen the Act. On the other hand, it may not. It does, however, mean we ought to take a hard look at that question, and that's what we're here to do today. Several of the contending parties have visited with me in the last several weeks, and I will say publicly what I have said to them. I come to these issues with an open mind. I've taken no position on either of the bills before us, but I am very interested to hear the arguments of all the witnesses today. I want to commend my colleagues, Mr. Goodlatte and Mr. Boucher, for their excellent work in bringing these issues before us. They are both well-versed in high technology issues, and they are a real credit to this committee. I appreciate all of you coming today, and we look forward to your testimony. I now turn to the ranking member, Congressman Conyers, and then I will recognize the sponsors of these bills, Mr. Goodlatte and Mr. Boucher, for their opening statements. Mr. Conyers.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and my colleagues and all of the distinguished witnesses that are here. This is an important matter, and I'd like to begin by reminding the members of the importance of this hearing. This represents one of the most critical segments of our economy, nearly a seventh of our entire gross national product, affecting everyone and every business thereby. It's always been my position to support competition in all sectors to give consumers access to the greatest selection of options at the best prices. Unfortunately, to date, I've not been impressed with the state of competition in the telecommunications industry. The fact of the matter is that cable rates essentially deregulated under the 1996 Act have gone up over 20% in 6 years, and the competition and innovation among the bells have resulted in a wave of mergers and consolidations. 7 bells to 4, and the cable industry is in the process of being swallowed whole by the long distance and software industries. The bill of my colleagues on the committee, and I too commend them, brings 2 critical communications issues before the committee. The first question is whether Congress should impose open access requirements on high-speed cable to the internet. Part of this issue comes down to whether high-speed access is a unique monopoly service which can't be duplicated, or whether it is one of many equally good routes to the internet. In addition, we need to consider what impact, if any, regulating high-speed cable will have on the ability of the cable industry to convert the technology into two-way telephone service, which of course competes with the bells. The other huge question before us is whether we should relax the statutory restrictions on long-distance service by the bells so they can enter the field of long-distance data transmissions. On this point, there seems to be some clarity in the observation that the bells should fully open up their networks to local competition before they should be able to enter long distance. The statutory requirement serves 2 purposes. First, it ensures that the bells can't use their local phone monopoly to create a monopoly in long distance, and it creates a strong financial incentive for the bells to open up their own networks to competition. Data transmission represents half of all the traffic on the telephone network and will soon go beyond 90%. So if we are to abandon the long-distance entry test for data, we will have to see very strong and compelling evidence that doing so will not harm competition and will not negatively impact consumers. And so I approach this hearing subject to these observations with great interest in the comments that will come from a very distinguished panel. The telecommunications industry was frankly born into monopoly, and it took 3 antitrust suits to finally bring some semblance of competition to Ma Bell. Competition and antitrust were also at the heart of the long-distance restrictions included in the '96 Telecommunications Act. So let's have at it, but let's remember that the consumers and our citizens should be predominant in the concerns that we resolve here this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Conyers. Mr. Goodlatte, gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for holding this hearing today. Clearly, the turnout that we have is evidence that either this is perhaps the most important issue related to the future of the Internet, or at least we've struck a nerve. I want to welcome everybody today. In my opinion, this is a tremendous issue and does very much relate to the future of the Internet. The promise and potential of the Internet is boundless, and we are just beginning to realize and understand how fundamental the Internet's impact on society will be. I hope that this will be the first of many Judiciary Committee hearings that will take a long-range view of the development of the Internet and our future as both a nation and as an increasingly connected global electronic community. Mr. Chairman, the legislation we hear testimony on this morning was introduced by Congressman Boucher and myself earlier this year because we felt we had no alternative. As we move from the current world of narrowband or slower speed Internet service into the world of high-speed or broadband Internet service, we recognize that the Internet is at a crossroads. One path continues to encourage the qualities that have made the Internet the revolutionary technology we enjoy today, freedom, competition, and consumer choice. The other path is characterized by limited competition and higher prices, followed by inevitable attempts at burdensome regulations by aggressive federal government agencies. This path results when a company can abuse its market power to restrict the ability of businesses to compete on the Internet and restrict the ability of consumers to access the Internet provider and content of their choice. The Internet as we know it, open, competitive, and easily available to consumers, will cease to exist. That path, unfortunately, is the path we are on right now. Congress must act now to ensure that the qualities that made the Internet a revolutionary tool for both business and users, deregulation, competition, and easy consumer access, remain fundamental components of the Internet for future generations. The first goal of our legislation is deregulation. The bill gets the FCC out of the business of regulating the Internet. It accomplishes this by eliminating existing FCC regulations that are inhibiting the development and rollout of certain types of broadband Internet service in non-urban and rural areas. The second goal our legislation accomplishes is to ensure consumer choice through open competition. Through the clarification of current antitrust law and the deregulation of restrictive regulations on the ability of phone companies to compete in the provision of nationwide data services, our legislation provides competition in both the Internet service provider and the Internet backbone markets. Finally, our legislation encourages open consumer access for consumers by encouraging the rollout of high-speed Internet service into rural and non-metropolitan areas more quickly. The relaxation of existing regulations on the phone companies would allow them to more quickly enter the backbone market, rolling out high-speed service to more and more rural areas. The bill also rewards the phone companies for meeting certain rollout requirements by removing rate and price regulations. These requirements include conditioning local loops for high-speed service by competitors and filing plans with their state regulatory agencies for the predicted rollout of broadband service. The principles of free market competition, low government regulation, and open consumer access have guided the growth of the Internet. The environment that has nurtured this early growth must be preserved and strengthened to spur continued innovation and ensure that the Internet and information-based economy continue to flourish. Our legislation will ensure that this environment continues to thrive in a way that avoids the heavy hand of government regulation while applying current antitrust law to ensure competition and protect both consumers and small businesses as we move into the 21st century. Mr. Chairman, I think it's especially important that the Judiciary Committee has taken the lead on this issue and addressing it from an antitrust standpoint, because I think this is a place where we can truly speak for a competitive environment and work to continue to see the Internet grow. But in order to accomplish that, we must make sure that no company, no industry dominates this market. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Boucher.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's been my pleasure to work with my Virginia colleague, Mr. Goodlatte, in authoring two items of legislation which are the subject of our hearing today, which taken together address the major challenges that confront the Internet in our time. If enacted into law, the legislation that we have put forward will strengthen the Internet and will assure its growth and development. And I want to thank Chairman Hyde for assembling today's discussion, which is focused on these two items of legislation. Until the present time, congressional debate on matters that affect the Internet have been ad hoc. They have been for a single purpose only. The bills that Mr. Goodlatte and I have put forward provide the first comprehensive framework for debate by the Congress of the major current Internet policy challenges. And I hope that today's hearing will be but the first formal step in a process that will lead to passage of these measures by the Congress during the course of this Congress. These are the goals that we're seeking to achieve. First, we want to assure that all people who connect to the Internet can select the Internet access provider of their choice, whatever platform they have chosen for transport service. This open architecture is the model to which Americans have become accustomed. Most people connect to the internet today using telephone lines, and under current law, they can choose among an array of internet access providers. If the telephone company that offers transport services also offers an internet access service, the customer may choose the telephone company's internet access service. But he is equally free to choose to purchase internet access from some other provider. Unfortunately, that requirement does not extend at the present time to the cable industry. And as cable companies deploy high-speed cable modem services, they are requiring that their cable modem transport customers purchase either at-home or Roadrunner, their affiliated internet access services. This arrangement threatens to close an internet architecture that, because of its previous openness, has enabled the internet to grow and develop. This arrangement will deny customers a free and fair choice. And this arrangement threatens the very existence of many of the some 5,000 internet access providers found across the nation today. The legislation we propose would keep the internet architecture open, would assure customer choice, and would enable internet access providers to continue to reach their business base of customers. As a second major purpose, our legislation will assure greater competition in the offering of internet backbone services by permitting the Bell operating companies to provide data across LATA boundaries as long as the data does not consist of a voice-only long-distance service. This provision is essential to assure adequate backbone services in many rural areas of the nation and to protect the peering arrangements among backbone providers that keep internet traffic flowing without charges among the various segments of the internet backbone today. This insurance policy against a very real threat of concentration in the offering of backbone services will help to keep the prices for internet connections for all Americans reasonable. Our comprehensive legislation will also achieve these additional goals. By deregulating DSL services, we will strengthen the financial case for the deployment of this broadband offering to homes and to places of work across the nation by telephone companies. This provision will help to increase the speed of internet connections and address one of the major policy challenges that confront internet consumers today. We propose to give new legal tools to internet service providers to protect their facilities from onslaughts of spam. We propose to authorize digital signatures for all commercial transactions so that no party to a commercial transaction can disavow that transaction due to the absence of a physical written signature. We propose new guarantees for the competitors of telephone companies in offering DSL services by making available to them reconditioned loops at an earlier time so that they can, in a more efficient way, offer a competitive DSL service. And we propose a new right of privacy, assuring that all internet users will now know what information is collected from them by websites, how that information is disseminated, if at all, by the website, and then have an opportunity to opt out of visiting the website without any information about them being collected. These measures are carefully balanced. They are integrated, each with the others, and together they will keep the internet open and encourage its development. Mr. Chairman, I thank you again for organizing today's discussion, and I look forward to hearing from our distinguished witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Boucher. Before I introduce the panel, Mr. Bryant, a member of our committee, has been drafted by the Commerce Committee and apparently became a free agent and signed with them and is no longer with us. However, we came out #1 in the draft, and we have his replacement. So I'd like to introduce the newest member of the committee, Representative David Vitter of the 1st District of Louisiana. Mr. Vitter is a graduate of Harvard University and the Tulane University Law School. He was also a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. He practiced law for many years in Louisiana. He also taught law at Tulane and Loyola law schools. He served 7.5 years in the Louisiana State Legislature, where he was a champion of lower taxes, smaller government, and swifter punishment for criminals. We welcome him to the committee today, Mr. David Vitter. Our first and only panel today consists of 11 witnesses who have various perspectives on the bills we're considering. Our first witness is Mr. Bill Barr, the Executive Vice President and General Counsel of GTE Corporation. Mr. Barr has a bachelor's and a master's degree from Columbia University and a law degree from George Washington University. After law school, he clerked for Judge Malcolm Wilkie of the D.C. Circuit. He has a long and distinguished career in public service, both at the Central Intelligence Agency and the Department of Justice, culminating with his service as Attorney General from 1991 to 1993. Before coming to GTE, he was in private practice with the Washington law firm of Shaw, Pittman, Potts, and Trowbridge. Our next witness is Mr. George Vraedenberg, the Senior Vice President of America Online. Mr. Vraedenberg is a graduate of Oberlin College and Harvard Law School. He has been a partner at the law firm of Latham and Watkins and has served in the legal departments of CBS and Fox. He joined AOL as its general counsel in 1997 and has been with the company ever since. Our next witness is Mr. Ken Wask, the president of the Software and Information Industry Association. Mr. Wash, I hope I'm pronouncing, is it soft, Mr. Wash?
Yes.
Mr. Wash is a graduate of Lehigh University and the State University of New York at Buffalo Law School. After law school, he spent 8 years with the Department of Energy. In 1984, he founded the Software Publishers Association, and he led that association until this year, when it merged with the Information Industry Association. He's now the leader of the newly merged association that he represents here today. Our next witness is Mr. Eric Sten, the Commissioner of Public Works for the City of Portland, Oregon. Commissioner Sten is a graduate of Stanford University and served for many years as Chief of Staff to a city commissioner in Portland before being elected in his own right in 1996. During that time, he became recognized for his work in the field of housing. As Commissioner of Public Works, he is responsible for, among other things, the city's Office of Cable Communications and Franchise Management. Our next witness is Mr. Scott Cleland, Managing Director of the Legg Mason Precursor Group. Mr. Cleland has a bachelor's degree from Kalamazoo College and a master's degree from the University of Texas. He has a long career in government, serving in the State Department, the Treasury Department, and the Office of Management and Budget. He also has extensive experience in the private sector, working with Booz Allen and Hamilton, Charles Schwab and Company, and Legg Mason. Our next witness is Mr. Mark Rosenblum, the Vice President for Law of AT&T. Mr. Rosenblum is a graduate of the University of Maryland and the University of Michigan Law School. Mr. Rosenblum practiced with the law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell before joining AT&T in 1984. He has been with the company since that time, rising to his current position last year. Next, Mr. Mike Salisbury, the Executive Vice President and General Counsel of MCI Communications. Mr. Salisbury is a graduate of Dartmouth, and he has a JD and an MBA from the University of Virginia. He was previously the managing partner of the Washington office of the law firm of Jenner and Block. He came to MCI as its general counsel, and after its merger with WorldCom, he has had the same role with the newly merged company.
You notice behind the men, there are women.
Our next witness is Mr. Tim Boggs, the Senior Vice President of Time Warner. Mr. Boggs is a graduate of the University of Wisconsin. He is also a veteran of the staff of this committee, and we extend to him a special welcome in that regard. He joined Warner Communications in 1982 and has been with the company in its various forms since then. Our next witness is Mr. John Windhausen, the president of the Association for Local Telecommunications Services. Mr. Windhausen is a graduate of Yale University and the UCLA Law School. He has had a distinguished career in government, serving at the Federal Communications Commission and the Senate Commerce Committee. Since leaving the committee, he's worked at the Competition Policy Institute as well as teaching at Georgetown University.
You begin to Mine.
Our next witness is Mr. Todd Jacobs, the Senior Telecommunications Analyst at Sanford C. Bernstein and Company. Mr. Jacobs has a bachelor's degree from Northwestern University and a master's from the Columbia University Journalism School. Before becoming a securities analyst, he had a career in journalism and was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize and an Emmy Award. He joined his current company in 1989 and became a partner in 1995. Our final witness is Mr. Gene Kimmelman, the co-director of the Washington office of Consumers Union, the publisher of Consumer Reports. He is a graduate of Brown University and the University of Virginia Law School. He served 2 years as the chief counsel of the Senate Judiciary Committee's Antitrust Subcommittee. He also has worked with the Consumer Federation of America and Congress Watch. He is recognized as a leading consumer advocate on telecommunications issues. We welcome all of you and look forward to your testimony, and I would request that you try to confine your remarks to 5 minutes. The entirety of your statement will be received into the record and, of course, will be read and studied. But because we have so many witnesses, it would be helpful if you could abbreviate your comments in general and leave time for questions.
Mr. Chairman,
might
all the members have an opportunity to submit any written introductory statements that they may not have made?
Absolutely. Anyone who has an introductory statement, it shall be received into the record at this point without objection. Mr. Barr.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to commend Congressman Goodlatte and Boucher for their leadership on this critical issue. You know, when you think about it, there's no institution that is potentially as central to our economic and our communal life as the Internet. It's more than just a method of communication. It's really a marketplace where buyers find sellers and commercial transactions are executed. And it's more than an entertainment media. It's become the primary means of the dissemination of opinions and ideas. It's really become very much a commons, a public commons and a public forum. Now, the principal constraint that has been operating on the Internet today is that while the backbone of the Internet can carry rivers of data, the pipeline to the house can only carry a trickle. And there have been two solutions that have been developed, one by the phone companies and one by the cable companies. These are technological solutions that can transform those pipes into high bandwidth pipes capable of pumping rivers of data into the home. Now, this will effectuate the promise of the Internet, and people are desperate for it, desperate to get that high bandwidth, because that's when video can come over. Video, incidentally, which competes with cable. And that's how you can have real-time teleconferencing and other things like that. Now, how do we get that out to people as quickly as possible? Everyone here says we're for competition. Well, let that be the benchmark. We should be for anything that maximizes competition on the Internet, because that ensures the widest and the quickest deployment of this technology, but it also ensures that the Internet will be diverse, will be innovative, and will continue to grow. And that's what the Goodlatte-Boucher bill does. It maximizes competition on the Internet. This is the key point. The status quo is not full competition or competition. There are obstacles in place today that constrain and limit competition. And what the Goodlatte-Boucher bill does is it eliminates those obstacles and it unleashes the forces of competition. I can't imagine a more deregulatory, pro-competitive approach to dealing with the Internet than this bill. It basically says the Internet is a regulation-free zone. Let the competition begin. Now, what's the first obstacle? I said there were two. The first obstacle is that the cable companies are asserting that they have the unique right, no one else has this in the telecommunications industry, to engage in a grossly anti-competitive practice that violates a basic tenet of open access, which has been the bedrock of maintaining competition in telecommunications industry. And what this is a simple tactic. It says, if we own the local wire, then we can dictate to you what services you get over it, and we can require that you only get our services over it. This is a form of improper tying that has historically curtailed competition in telecommunications markets. If a person has an advantage in one market and seeks to leverage it into another by saying, if you buy product A from me, I'm going to force you to buy product B. That's anti-competitive. That's not pro-competitive, because you curtail competition in market B and you limit consumer choice. If all the electric utilities today got together and said, hey, it's our electricity you're using, and if you want to use our electricity, you have to buy your appliances from our subsidiary. You can't use any other appliances. That curtails competition in the appliance market. That's anti-competitive and has always been found anti-competitive. Now, this bill prohibits this tactic by requiring open access. And that open access is born of bitter experience over the past century. These telecommunications industries of the past were not born into monopoly. What happened was, at the beginning of the century, AT&T tried exactly the same tactic. They bought up the local pipeline and said, if you want to get long distance, you have to buy our long distance product. And that led to a monopoly. And we've been spending decades trying to undo it. Same thing happened in cable. The cable companies in the 1980s said, we own the pipeline, we're going to control the content. And that eliminated virtually the independent video programmers. And in both cases, open access was imposed by Congress, but after the fact, after the damage was done. And what's stunning here is that the same two players, AT&T and the cable companies, are trying to do exactly the same thing in the internet market. Say, we control the pipe, you have to use our content, you have to use our transportation system. The second obstacle is that there's a direct prohibition and burdening of the telephone company's ability to come in and compete and provide their high bandwidth service. And just look at this, and this is how I'm going to conclude. Just look at this difference. AT&T is saying, we need, if we're restricted to the revenue from local transport, then we have no incentive to invest in high bandwidth. We have no incentive. So we not only need to compete in the vertical stream, but we have to capture that through a compelled tie-in with our customers. We have to say we need to force the customers to get into our ISP. We need to get the backbone revenue. Otherwise, we don't have the incentive to deploy. But look what the rules are doing to the telephone company. The rules for the telephone company say you can't even compete. You can't even compete, much less lock in. And all we're saying is, let us compete in those markets. We're not asking for a lock-in. We're asking to compete in those markets. The bottom line is this. When AT&T and the cable companies say they want free competition, they want to compete, but they want to keep their competitors burdened so they can't compete. And second, when they say they want competition, they want to be insulated from the traditional free market rules that apply to everybody else in the telecommunications industry. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Vraedenberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Minority Member Conyers. And I, too, want to commend Congressman Goodlatte and Boucher for introducing this legislation, which addresses what we at AOL think is perhaps one of the most important issues regarding the future development of the Internet. I want to take up on the theme, Mr. Conyers, that you raised, the consumer. One of the most remarkable things about what's happened in the Internet is the extent to which the consumers are taking on board this Internet phenomenon. They're adopting the Internet, far outpacing the predictions of anyone a few years ago, and they're adopting the Internet at a rate which exceeds the adoption of television, of radio, of any other medium in history. Every month, 1.5 million Americans are joining the online world, bringing the percentage of the U.S. population now using the Internet from 0 in 1990 to over 30% today. In addition to the number of consumers coming online, businesses are going online as well. And with each new business comes some more competition in this space. What's remarkable is that there's competition at every level of the value chain. There's competition among 6,000 Internet service providers. There's competition among a variety, scores of portals. And there are millions of websites. And there's competition at a fierce level, a primitive level, at every level of this value chain. This competition has spurred enormous innovation and has brought consumer prices down. And attached to my testimony, you will see what exactly the product have been for American consumers: falling prices, improving service. Amazingly, all this power, all this competition and choice today is coming to residential consumers through one telephone line, a voice telephone system built for another purpose in another age, but all of this competition is coming through that one telephone line. And that, Mr. Chairman, is the secret sauce of this Internet. The single telephone line on which the Internet rests is open to all competitors on the same terms. As a result, there are virtually no barriers to entry into this marketplace. There are no last-mile gatekeepers deciding who can get in and who cannot get into the Internet business. The appeal of a product in the marketplace rather than who owns the wire is what determines success, and consumers can select the Internet service of their choice rather than the one chosen for them by the wireline carrier. Now, the reason that the wire is open is a series of decisions in an antitrust context that the courts have made and this Congress has made over the last 30 years to assure that that infrastructure is open to all comers. And as a result, consumers are the drivers and the beneficiaries of this fierce competitive and open environment. The government has simply kept the playing field open and level. Soon the Internet is going to be available in broadband capacity, as Mr. Barr noted. And in that world, Internet services are going to include voice, video, and data services, all three of them, in a convergent mix. And while today's broadband services, or excuse me, narrowband services run over a single telephone wire, it is possible in the future that these broadband services will run on a tapestry of multiple systems, including telephone, cable, satellite, and wireless. Yet over the next few years, the most likely carriers of these services are going to be our telephone and our cable systems. Yet those two systems have different histories, subject to different regulatory treatment by the government. The telephone system is open and transparent, pursuant to policies of antitrust courts and this Congress, and cable remains a regulated monopoly, closed to competitive forces, notwithstanding the best efforts of this Congress to the contrary. In an age of convergence, when the Internet's digital technology is eliminating the historic distinction between voice and video and data, we can no longer pursue a fundamentally schizophrenic attitude between these two historic voice and video systems. We must choose between competition, the choice of the antitrust courts in the telephone context, and the 96 Act, and the regulated monopoly, the path taken by the cable industry. The adoption of an industrial policy specifically favoring one particular competitor or technology, such as cable, is fundamentally incompatible with the digital convergence that's happening in the Internet, as well as the command of our national economic policy, the competitive economic outcomes, and not government choice, are the best protectors of the consumer welfare. The bills before this committee go a long way towards remedying the situation. We commend Messrs. Goodlatte and Boucher for their approach. It's one that relies on our antitrust history, is forward-looking, and is market-driven. Is consistent with the government's policy over the last 3 decades to rely on competition and not regulation to enhance consumer welfare. Every member of this committee is well aware of the most famous antitrust case in this nation's history, United States versus AT&T. That consent decree resolved the AT&T case and ushered in an era of consumer choice in long distance and telephone equipment that unquestionably has benefited every one of your constituents. As we enter the broadband world, real and substantial threats are emerging to the Internet access market. Strong, immediate, and unequivocal congressional action is needed to preserve competition and openness. The Goodlatte-Boucher legislation does this by narrowly prescribing anti-competitive actions in this field, and we urge you to move quickly on that legislation, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Vraedenberg. Next, Mr. Wash.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, and thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. The Software and Information Industry Association was formed in January of this year through the merger of the former Software Publishers Association and the Information Industry Association. We represent over 1,400 companies who produce valuable information and software products crucial to the growth of electronic commerce. Every few years, the computer industry experiences the advent of new technologies that dramatically change how computers are used and how we access information. While much has been accomplished in the last 15 years in terms of creating and enhancing this crucial infrastructure, the fact of the matter is, Mr. Chairman, that most people today access the Internet through 28.8 baud modems. These connections are much too slow to receive or send robust products such as complex interactive services or further convergence of voice, data, and video products that are in the marketplace today, but generally available only to large businesses. These products could easily be available to smaller enterprises and consumers as well, and would ensure that the Internet becomes an even more valuable medium for U.S. consumers and an even greater engine of economic growth. We are on the verge of a rollout of broadband Internet services. As the principal representative of the code and content companies, SIIA is concerned that consumers be able to choose how they wish to access the Internet. Consumer choice, not controls by the government or of certain favored players, is the proven way to assure a competitive, vibrant marketplace. Competition among all segments of Internet transport industries assures that consumers retain the freedom to select both the means by which they access the Internet and the service provider whose offerings of code and content best meets their needs. Internet transport providers such as telephone, cable, wireless, and satellite companies should not be able to engage in anti-competitive practices that frustrate or forestall consumer choice. Predominant carriers that are able to control unfairly the initial access to the Internet by bundling advanced communication services can also limit consumer purchases of Internet services, including the valuable code and content that customers want. The ability of any provider of broadband services to gain an unfair advantage through a monopoly control of its services and intentionally preclude consumer access to multiple Internet service providers is a worrisome development. Consumers may effectively be denied choice in terms of the content that would otherwise be readily and easily available to them. We echo the comments of Mr. Vraedenberg sitting to my left that consumers will not be served if there are last-mile gatekeepers. Let me be clear, Mr. Chairman, we're not concerned that certain Internet content will be blocked completely from access. Rather, the industry believes it benefits no one if transport providers, through unfair monopoly control, can bundle services selectively and hinder consumers from viewing and purchasing online products and services. See, all ISPs have the ability to cache content so that their customers can access it faster. In addition, ISPs frequently customize the first screen customers see when accessing the Internet. However, we cannot minimize the impact of having content selection made by the ISP, especially if the broadband service provider is the only transport service realistically available to the customer that the provider offers no choice. Any broadband carrier that can exercise unfair market power that adversely affects the consumer choice of Internet service provider can also effectively foreclose the distribution vehicle to code and content products of all types. Let's consider an example in a situation where, let's say, the opening screen of a favored ISP promoted Visa instead of MasterCard or American Express as the credit card of choice, or Reuters rather than Bloomberg's as the favored news source. The firm not selected for this preferential treatment would not necessarily be blocked from customer access, but it is clear that a tilting of the playing field can have an enormous impact on which products or services are even known to consumers, let alone used by them. We would not be concerned if there existed a wide range of broadband providers and each makes his own independent selections. The SIA's policy group had a very spirited debate concerning this issue, and we do not at this point take any position on the specific provisions of the Boucher-Goodlatte legislation. We have a series of questions we would like the committee to consider, and those are contained within my broader written statement. In conclusion, the broadband marketplace must be competitive, allowing code and content providers the maximum choice in how they deliver and how consumers access products and services on the Internet. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wash. Commissioner Stent.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Eric Stent, and I'm a city commissioner from Portland, Oregon. And under our form of government, I'm the lead elected official on cable and telecommunications matter, and I'd like to give you a local perspective on these issues. In December of 1998, the City of Portland was asked to approve the transfer, as were hundreds of cities across the country, of the TCI franchise to AT&T. In Portland, that's a two-step process. First, we have a citizens commission that looks at the issues. This is a group of everyday people from across the board who volunteer their time to look at what's in the public interest. They make a recommendation, and that comes to the Portland City Council, and we ultimately must approve all transfers. Both our Citizens Commission and the Portland City Council were excited about some of the opportunities that AT&T is bringing to Portland, we think. We are excited to have competition in local phone service that's needed in Portland. We are very excited to have high-speed Internet access available at the home. That's a product we very much welcome. But both our Citizens Commission and our elected officials came to the conclusion that we thought open access was necessary to provide the kind of service that Portland has become accustomed to. We believe in competition, we believe in choice, and from our citizens' point of view, and I've talked to hundreds of businesses since this issue has been raging in Portland over the last 6 months, the idea of having one way to access high-speed cable internet modems is not acceptable in Portland, Oregon. We have gone through the problems with monopolies in our city, and we simply believe that open access is the best approach. It's a common sense position, and it's been supported across the board in Portland. I've submitted detailed written testimony that outlines our legal arguments and all of the thought we went through, but I wanted to share with you today 3 or 4 key points that continue to come up in Portland. The first is this issue is not going to go away anytime soon. After buying TCI or merging with TCI, AT&T also gained control of Paragon. So we used to have 2 cable systems in Portland. Now we have 1, and they're both controlled by AT&T. This issue will not be resolved quickly, and hundreds of cities across the country have been and will continue to be faced with the same problem Portland has, which is trying to come up with the right approach and trying to enforce local policies for competition and choice when there is no national structure in place. Now is the time for Congress to act, in our opinion, and to put an open access policy in place. Secondly, and I suspect you have heard and will hear that local governments are trying to regulate the internet. That's a term that's been thrown around a lot. Simply said, that couldn't be further from the truth. We have no interest in regulating the internet, never have, never will. None of our regulations have anything to do with content. In fact, by providing open access and choice, we believe we're opening up the internet and giving people in Portland the chance to subscribe to the kind of internet service provider they want, whatever it is. We have no interest in regulating the internet, only the public facilities. Thirdly, we do not favor different technical standards. You will hear the argument, and it's been bandied about, that if local governments take action on these issues, you will have 30,000 different technical standards. We haven't asked for, nor have we regulated any technical standard. We believe that the technical standard should be decided by the cable industry and by the FCC. Our rule simply says that we must have open access in Portland. It's legal and was upheld by a federal district court after AT&T sued us. Finally, and this is probably the most important point, I think, for you to consider, this is not an issue that citizens saw coming. Even as the cable commissioner in Portland, is not an issue I saw coming, but it's been raging in our paper and on our talk radio stations for 6 months. Obviously, we were sued. It had a large impact. It's been very, very well discussed, and it's very, very important to local citizens. Whenever I'm stopped on the street or in the grocery store, the response is always keep fighting for open access. They've experienced monopolies in the past. They've experienced lack of choice. And even if, as AT&T has threatened, this slows down high-speed internet access in Portland, people are willing to take a breath and fight to have open access and choice in the years to come. I believe you will continue to hear more from cities, more from constituents, and more from your citizens as they begin to understand the importance of this issue. In conclusion, what I would say is that we just firmly believe in Portland, Oregon, that open access is in the public interest, and we will remain firm despite the tremendous amount of pressure that has been put upon us. I'd like to share 2 incidences with you, and we have tried hard to work with AT&T, and as I said in my opening, we welcome many of their products, and we welcome their investment in our community and have had a good relationship. After our city council reviewed our citizens' recommendation that open access was the right approach, and after we voted unanimously as a 5-person city council to require open access when the transfer came before us, an AT&T representative remarked to the local paper and was quoted as saying, "I hope Portland has a very large legal budget." Well, we don't, but we do have principles in Portland, and we are willing to stand up for those principles. AT&T sued us over this. We went to federal district court. I'm sure you have a copy. There's a 16-page opinion by a federal district judge that's clear and unequivocal that we had the authority to do it. Now we're going to spend more and more local taxpayer dollars having this appealed. They'll appeal it again after we win that case. After we won the case, the court case, AT&T put out a written press release that said the real losers in this are the citizens of Portland and Multnomah County. I will end by saying we believe strongly, as much as we like investment in our community, that no large corporation should be able to hold a community hostage and threaten not to put key public services in place because they disagree with local policy. If you take that as a backdrop, now is the time for you to act. Now is the time for congressional policy. I would like to commend Representatives Goodlatte and Boucher for this bill. This is very important, and it's important that you act and take us out of this position of AT&T exerting its will on local communities despite local law. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Sten. Mr. Cleland.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the honor of testifying. The views expressed here are mine alone. I'd like to also commend Congressman Goodlatte and Boucher for their bills. First, I have two brief insights from a market perspective. In general, investors are very wary of any legislation because what it does is increase uncertainty, and they dislike uncertainty. However, the proposed legislation, I think, will probably have a marginal effect on the overall level of investment in broadband. I don't think either open or closed access will substantially slow broadband deployment investment overall. However, it could have a very large effect over how investment moves between industries. Second, I'd like to offer some questions and some comments from the peanut gallery. Why has cable closed internet access to competitors, and why are they limiting streaming video to 10 minutes? I believe that cable's deregulatory rhetoric is a Trojan horse designed to divert attention from what's really going on, and that is reducing the potential for more competition to cable. The Goodlatte-Boucher bills recognize that there's more than one threat to the internet than government regulation. There's also the threat of anti-competitive behavior by owners of scarce broadband conduit. While it's always wise for government to let markets work and not regulate, this committee also recognizes that the market works best when everyone is free to compete and innovate. Both bills recognize that you do not have to compromise on competition or non-discriminatory access in order to deregulate. The bills employ a wise, non-regulatory, antitrust enforcement approach. Now, it appears from the tenor of this debate that somehow deregulation and infrastructure deployment are supposed to be more important public policy goals than promoting competition or protecting consumers. Now, I've been trying to find what congressional action or what FCC decision reordered those priorities. I can find none. What decision officially endorsed that the trade-off of the ends of deregulation and broadband deployment justify the means of reducing competition and safeguarding consumer interests? Now, if you listen to this debate a lot, one could get the false impression that cable was already deregulated and cable had no market power. Well, Congress, in fact, has found that the cable industry has anti-competitively used its scarce conduit control to stifle competition in several markets. Congress created program access to foster DBS competition. Congress created must-carry access to foster broadcast competition. Congress created leased access to foster video programming competition. Congress created navigation device access to foster cable equipment competition. Now, cable open access for internet, it doesn't appear to be a new or isolated problem. Now, finally, what's at stake in this debate? I think we are at a major fork in the road on this nation's policy towards competition, towards convergence, towards internet, and towards electronic commerce. Will the nation continue down an open, pro-competitive road it has traversed for the last 30 years, or will the nation now divert to a less competitive road in the future? In conclusion, I have 4 more questions. Very important first one is, will the internet technology be allowed to compete with cable? By way of analogy, think of the internet as the next DBS. Will the government enable internet competitors to compete against cable with open access as the government enabled direct broadcast satellite to compete against cable with program access? Without an open access, there can't be competition. And we have 10 million DBS consumers in the last 6 years because of what Congress did in '92. Open access offers a phenomenal increase in consumer choice for video programming. That's what it's all about. If somebody can be a competitive micro programmer and offer different programming to consumers, consumers are going to love it. Another question, will cable be allowed to corner part of the high-end residential e-commerce market? In other words, will scarce conduit market power be allowed to be vertically leveraged into internet content and into e-commerce? Third question, will the government keep the unregulated internet separated from the regulated infrastructure? Or are you going to allow cable to merge itself with the internet in order to self-deregulate? And the last question is, will the FCC continue a schizophrenic policy of hyper-regulating the local telcos last mile while taking a look the other way policy towards the cable last mile? This sends the marketplace very mixed signals and will lead to skewed investment in a broadband duopoly, not a competitive marketplace. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the honor of testifying.
Thank you, Mr. Cleland. Mr. Rosenblum.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members. It's a pleasure to be here today to discuss H.R. 1685 and 1686. AT&T is investing over $100 billion in cable systems to transform them into new communications facilities.
Could you pull the mic a little closer, please?
Yes, I'm very sorry. Is that doing better? Thanks. We're investing this money to transform cable systems into new communications facilities that we think will bring new technology and services to our customers. Our plan is to use these facilities to compete in local telephone markets across the country, offering competition to the incumbent monopoly telephone companies, bringing lower price, better service, and for the first time, real choice to millions of residential customers. One of these new choices is the broadband internet access service we hope customers will be able to obtain from cable companies in partnership with firms like At Home and Roadrunner. These providers have innovated and invested to build high-speed networks and bring new content to cable customers. Contrary to some rhetoric, these networks are not closed. Customers can and do access any site on the public internet through these new services. There is no limit whatever on internet access or where customers can go on the internet once they get these services. All they do is get an additional choice, and we think they get faster and better service than they could before. Since AT&T unveiled its investment in cable, deployment of all types of broadband access facilities has skyrocketed. DSL technology, that's the technology that turns a telephone line into a broadband-capable pipe, has been available for years. But it's only been in the past few months that Bell companies and GTE began accelerating their deployment and reducing the price for these services, and we think that's in response to the competition they sense coming from companies like AT&T. 4 Bell companies and GTE have announced that DSL service will be available to as many as 31 million consumers across the country by the end of this year alone. These emerging competitive forces are really the product of the competition from AT&T. The investment and innovation you see in the industry represent a huge consumer and competition success story made possible by the 1996 Telecommunications Act, of which we think Congress should be very proud. What we're talking about today is bringing better service, better price, and more choices to customers. This is the promise of the Telecom Act, and I think it's the promise of the Sherman Act. These laws have unleashed the explosion in competitive investment by us and others, and it's made possible the competitive response by the incumbents that is really what's going to drive deployment of these new technologies to all customers. If the past 3 years have taught us anything, it's that the certainty provided by the Telecom Act has stimulated this competitive investment, without which the competitive response would not have been possible. We thus oppose allowing Bell companies to provide long-distance data services now before they open their local markets to competition, as the 1996 Act requires. In addition, we think the bill marks a sharp and unwarranted departure from established antitrust policy. Congress and the courts have uniformly recognized that the Sherman Act is a law of general application, and special laws applying to special industries have generally been rejected. This bill, in contrast, would impose a special rule for a single industry, creating a narrow, inflexible market definition, and it would bypass relevant case law. It would deem individual broadband providers to be market power participants in their own with market power, even though broadband competes with narrowband, and even though alternative suppliers can and do provide other broadband access capabilities. The bill's unprecedented presumption of antitrust liability in suits involving broadband internet access we think would lead to a litigation explosion. This would embroil the federal courts in setting the rates, terms, and conditions for internet access, leading to regulation of the internet that would seriously hinder the very innovation the antitrust laws are supposed to foster. We think the discussion today really is not about whether cable internet networks should be open. The choices and technologies that competition will create assure that all firms have every powerful incentive you can imagine to offer services and features that customers want. In our case, we've invested over $100 billion in a new technology to try to bring choice to our local customers. Virtually all of these customers today, though, are already served by the incumbent telephone monopolies or by the dominant internet provider, AOL. If we don't offer them the service they demand, they're simply not going to bring their business to us in the first place, and we'll never recover on our investment. If we don't meet their needs, they won't come. This market reality should dictate the way that markets and technology and consumer services develop. We submit new laws are not necessary. I respect very highly what Commissioner Sten and his colleagues have done in Portland, but other cities around the country, considering the same question, came to the decision that it would be inappropriate to impose open access requirements on cable providers, preferring instead to stimulate the deployment of our facilities, hoping that it would trigger deployment of competing facilities, and that has occurred. Commissioner Sten says national policy is required. Our reason for opposing what happened in Portland, Mr. Chairman, is not to impose litigation costs on the people of Portland. They are our customers. We just think that we can't afford to have individual cities making individual choices in this very important area. We've got a market, it's working, and we think the customer demand should drive it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Rosenblum. Mr. Salisbury.
Thank you, Chairman Hyde, Congressman Conyers, and members of the committee for the opportunity to speak to you today about these two bills that seek to promote the growth and development of the Internet free from unnecessary regulation. While MCI WorldCom wholeheartedly supports these goals, we cannot support either of these bills. Why? Not because MCI WorldCom opposes open access on cable TV systems, which we fully support, but because these bills would eviscerate a cornerstone of the Telecommunications Act of 1996, the requirement in Section 271 of the Act that the Bell operating companies must first open their local markets to competition before they are allowed to offer inter-lattice services. Very simply, the threat to the growth and development of the Internet lies in the ability to use a monopoly in one market, such as cable TV or local telephone service, to control high-speed access to Internet services. Section 271 requires that the Bell Company monopolies must be eliminated before they could engage in any such conduct. I would like to offer a few specific observations for the committee this morning. First, the Telecom Act does not prohibit the Bell Companies from offering inter-lattice data services indefinitely, only until they open their local markets to competition. Once its markets have been opened, a Bell Company is entirely free to offer any inter-lattice service. The only reason Bell Companies cannot provide inter-lattice data services today is that they have chosen to delay opening their local markets, prolonging their ability to earn monopoly profits. Congress should not reward this choice, which has cost consumers billions of dollars over the last 3 years. Second, there is no question that local markets can be opened. Under the leadership of the New York Public Service Commission, we are hopeful that the first state will have its local markets fully opened to competition before the end of this year. MCI WorldCom has worked very closely with the New York Commission to bring about this result, and we are heavily invested in its success. The message to the other Bell companies ought to be to work to open your markets like Bell Atlantic is doing in New York. Holding out the prospect of legislative relief from Section 271 before the Bells open their local markets only encourages further delays by them and deters additional investment by competitive local exchange companies. I would add that New York and several other states have required the Bell companies to offer high-speed access facilities as an unbundled network element, something these bills would undo. Third, there should be no illusion that the inter-lattice relief these bills would provide to the Bell companies can be limited to data services. Within a few years, all voice and data services will use the Internet protocol and will be indistinguishable to telecom switches. Thus, what these bills propose amounts to a total gutting of Section 271 of the Act. Fourth, there is no public policy basis for interlateral relief as sought by the bell companies. The Internet is vigorously competitive today. Virtually all consumers can choose from among many Internet service providers and connect to them with a local or toll-free call. More than 90% of all Americans can choose from 4 or more Internet service providers today, which is certainly more than you can say about local telephone service. By the end of this year, estimates are that high-speed Internet access via DSL or cable modems will be available to about half the homes in America. And while demand for Internet backbone capacity is growing rapidly, there is no shortage of capacity, and new competitors like Qwest and Level 3 are building new networks to meet this demand. Since the Telecom Act became law in 1996, Internet backbone capacity has grown from 1.2 terabits per second to 21.7 terabits per second, a nearly 20-fold increase. MCI WorldCom is supportive of the other goals of H.R. 1685 and 1686, most importantly ensuring that providers of high-speed Internet access via cable modems, as well as incumbent local exchange companies, offer open and non-discriminatory access to their local facilities. There is no policy justification for permitting cable television operators to leverage their dominance in the delivery of video services to restrict consumers' ability to choose freely their Internet service provider. But we cannot support any legislation that effectively would repeal Section 271 of the Act, the key provision for opening local markets to competition, and Section 251 with respect to DSL services. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Salisbury. Mr. Boggs.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Conyers, thank you for your welcome. It's a pleasure to work with the committee from this side of the table today and to discuss broadband technology with you. At Time Warner, we've had a long history of technological innovation and leadership, and we've long been interested in providing advanced services to consumers over our cable networks. Building on that foundation and as a result of the regulatory certainty created by the 96 Act, Time Warner is well into the process of upgrading all of its cable systems to a state-of-the-art hybrid fiber coaxial architecture. From Greensboro to Cincinnati, from Orlando to Milwaukee, from Boston to San Antonio, from LA to New York. When this is substantially completed by the end of the year, Time Warner will have invested over $4 billion of private capital upgrading its cable infrastructure, providing increased capacity for both video programming and other new digital services, as well as telephony competition. Under the law, we are required to upgrade the entire community, so rich and poor neighborhoods are reached by this capacity, and we also wire all schools and libraries for free in our communities. To make full use of the potential created by upgraded networks, Time Warner has teamed with Microsoft, Compaq, Media One, and Advanced Newhouse to develop Roadrunner, an independent affiliate, which provides an innovative mix of local and national content, as well as high-speed connection to the Internet. Roadrunner's cable operator affiliates, including Time Warner Cable, Media One, and many, many third-party cable operators, such as Media General in suburban Virginia, are providing additional local content on the network. Roadrunner's local online editors also assist schools, libraries, and museums in developing their approach to the Internet. The foundation of our Roadrunner service is our upgraded cable fiber coaxial network. This network provides the enhanced reliability and capacity of fiber optics and results in an increase in the delivery of content to the PC at home at speeds up to 100 times greater than today's residential telephone line. Customers reach our Roadrunner service and the Internet over the cable system without any need to dial into a local telephone number, and the service is always on. Of course, Roadrunner service must allow customers access to any site on the Internet. Nothing on the Internet is off limits to a Roadrunner customer, including the sites of Internet service providers. As you know, most content on the Internet is free, but some content providers, such as AOL, charge for their services. And if a Roadrunner user chooses to subscribe to such service, she need only click on the AOL icon on her computer screen. She will obtain access to all AOL content, web access, email, and other services. Roadrunner customers similarly can reach any other ISP posted on the net with a single mouse click, and many of our customers do just that. In fact, if they choose to set up their PC in their home to avoid any interface with the Roadrunner icons of any sort, they may simply do that. The service is designed to be customized by the customer. The development of the Internet is the quintessential example of the power of the free market. It was Congress's respect for market forces over governmental interference that allowed the market to meet the needs of consumers, to develop innovative new technologies such as we're discussing today, to grow the economy and provide the ultimate forum for communication. No one competitor has the ability to stand in the way of the global phenomenon that is the Internet today. For some to suggest that might be the case is nothing short of ridiculous. For although Time Warner and other cable companies are investing billions of dollars in upgrading our infrastructure, cable modem service is still in its infancy, with fewer than 1 million subscribers nationwide out of the current total of 29 million residential Internet subscribers. At this early stage in the development of broadband services, it would be a mistake for the government to choose and impose one business model on all broadband providers. Time Warner believes that cable companies and all players, be they satellite, wireless, or telephone companies, with their dynamic DSL offerings, should be encouraged to invest in the development of these new Internet access services through pro-competitive policies that leave each one free to experiment and develop its own business strategy. History tells us that consumers will be best served by government policies that spur the rapid rollout of high-speed broadband services by multiple players and multiple technologies, rather than by government mandates about business models which should be followed by the players in this field. Those companies that have urged a contrary approach are simply using the tired old Washington game of seeking to use the government to advance their own competitive advantages. However, as the respected FCC Commissioner Michael Powell wisely stated in a recent speech on the issue, competition policy should focus on the benefits and harms to consumers, not the effects on firms. Unfortunately, the bills before you today ignore this advice, as well as the pro-competitive paradigm set in the '96 Telecom Act. Rather than rely on the forces of a very dynamic market, these bills attempt to impose a one-size-fits-all platform and encourage companies to go to court rather than to participate in market development. In order to continue to thrive, this uniquely American but world-class Internet market needs more risk-takers and innovators, not more litigators and courtrooms. Mr. Chairman, the deployment of broadband services by cable is a wonderful development for consumers. Because of the investment and the risk undertaken by Time Warner, other cable companies, and our competitors at the table, the day in which families, schools, and libraries will have high-speed broadband access to anywhere on the Internet has become a reality. This should be a call for celebration, not a call for regulation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Boggs. Mr. Windhausen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Conyers, and other members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be here as well. I am the president of ALTS, which is the Association for Local Telecommunications Services. ALTS is the leading national trade association representing the competitors to the local telephone companies. We are facilities-based competitors. We are, in one sense, the companies who are where MCI was 20 years ago, only we are competing for local telephone service, not long distance. ALTS does not represent long-distance companies. We do not have a position, perhaps the only witness here that does not have a position on the cable open access issue. Our primary and principal focus is on the openness and unbundling of the local telecommunications marketplace. And I would like to state for this committee that our position is that we don't need new legislation to consider efforts to open up or exempt the phone companies from their obligations to open their local telephone network. We don't need new legislation. What we need is stronger enforcement of the existing legislation embodied in the Telecommunications Act of 1996. ALTS as an association has been around for about 12 years, but it's only really taken off in the last 3 years since the passage of that Telecom Act. As an association, we had 12 members in 1996. We now represent over 70 companies competing for local telephone service. And in fact, there are now over 150 companies nationwide who have entered that market. These companies didn't exist. Most of these companies did not even exist until the Telecom Act passed. These companies, which I'll refer to as CLECs, competitive local exchange companies, have raised billions of dollars in capital. They've invested in infrastructure. They've invested in deploying their own fiber optic cable and switches. And we are providing new, advanced, high-technology broadband services to both business and residential consumers. All of this activity has taken place because of the passage of that 1996 Act and because that Act's requirements that the local telephone market be opened up to competition. In fact, we are driving the deployment of broadband technologies in this country. We are the originators of the deployment of DSL services, and it's only because of the competition that our companies are bringing to the marketplace that the Bell companies and GTE are beginning to roll out their own DSL broadband services. They're doing so in response to the competitive threat that they are beginning to feel now from our companies. Having said that, there's a lot more that can be done. We could do even more if we could truly get the telephone companies to comply with the obligations they currently have under current law to open up their networks. 3 years later, 3 years after the Telecom Act passed, not a single one of the incumbent local telephone companies is in compliance. Not a single one of those local telephone companies has opened their networks to competitors on and treat us on a non-discriminatory basis. We constantly encounter systematic operational difficulties in obtaining access to that local telephone company network. And as a result, our market share today is still small. We have approximately 5% of that local telephone marketplace. We're growing. We've doubled our market share each of the last couple of years, but the local telephone market is still very far from being competitive. Now, we share the objectives of the authors of this legislation to promote broadband deployment, but our concern is that these bills, in fact, would slow down the deployment of broadband technologies. They would not enhance it. Why would they slow it down? For two principal reasons. First, they would give the phone companies exemptions from their requirements to open up their local network. They would slow down our ability to compete with them, and then they would slow down the telephone companies' rollout of advanced technologies because they would not be facing the same competitive threat. Furthermore, the bill would slow down the deployment of advanced broadband technologies by giving the RBOCs, the regional Bell operating companies, premature entry into the long-distance marketplace. As Mr. Conyers mentioned in his opening comments, about 50% of the traffic today is data traffic. If you allow the RBOCs to provide intra-LATA services for data, that removes a significant incentive for them to open up their networks. The goal of the Telecom Act of '96 was to get those phone companies to open their local networks first before they get into the long-distance market. So my suggestion is if you want to promote broadband deployment, the last thing you want to do is to grant exemptions that would allow the telephone companies to close down their networks. The telcos are not the solution, they are the problem. The solution is to continue to promote competition for local telephone services and to enforce the current act. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Windhausen. Mr. Jacobs.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Conyers, members of the committee, let me first give you 2 words on Sanford Bernstein, the company I work for. First off, we are almost unique on Wall Street in that we don't do investment banking, so my opinions are my own. I only have one set of clients, that's global money managers, and I only have one mandate, and that's to try to give them good advice. Now, relative to the debate taking place today, I think one of the problems when you get involved with debates like this is that you tend to get lost in the details and lose sight of the big picture. What's the big picture? In my opinion, there are basically 3 related questions. One is, what's the path to telecom competition in the local exchange? 2, what's the path to broadband competition? And 3, how are those 2 issues related? Now, relative to the goals, I think the Telecom Act is relatively clear. If you had a 9-year-old read the Act, once he woke up from it, he would basically argue that there are 2 pieces in the Act that are important. One is that the RBOCs are required to accommodate local competition, and 2 is that if they do so, they get into long distance as a reward. How are we faring so far? If you look at an exhibit in my written testimony, what you'll see is that on average, the RBOCs 3 years after the passage of the Telecom Act have lost approximately 4.5 to 6.5 points of market share. Now, if you cut that a little bit more finely, what you find is that in residential, they've actually lost only about 1%. So really all the action is taking place with respect to business customers, and it's simple to understand why. A business access line is about 5 times more profitable than a residential access line. They're also much more geographically clustered. It's almost impossible to economically efficiently go after the residential marketplace with facilities. So what most of the carriers had hoped for was a viable resale option. Now, in 1996, the FCC attempted to push a strategy called Uni-P. Uni-P was effectively a very highly discounted form of resale. But the reality was that the RBOX found Uni-P something that they couldn't accept. So they went to court, led by Mr. Barr on this panel, and they were quite successful in overturning legally the mandate that the RBOX offer up Uni-P to their competitors. As a result, there was effectively no other way to get into the local markets, especially for residential, other than facilities. Plain old resale, which is what we still have in front of us in most states, simply is not economically viable. That's why all of the long-distance carriers pulled out of the residential markets. Now, with respect to all of that, there was only really one company who ultimately still had to make a decision to figure out how to get into residential. That's AT&T. The sad fact for AT&T is that the company has about a $23 billion portfolio of consumer long-distance revenues. They are 60% market share holders in the consumer long-distance market. And the ultimate knowledge that AT&T had that eventually the RBOX would get into the business, and that since RBOX will easily be able to bundle long-distance service in with local service, and AT&T had no ability to bundle in local with long-distance, meant that AT&T was eventually going to get crushed by the RBOX when the RBOX entered those markets. That sad fact was what drove AT&T basically to acquire TCI. Now, make no mistake about it, the concept of AT&T acquiring TCI is not that AT&T likes the cable business. To the contrary, this was a very expensive, highly dilutive, very complicated transaction for AT&T. Crushed for a number of months afterwards. The sad fact is, again, that AT&T, for defensive reasons, not offensive reasons, has moved into the cable business. Now, step two is AT&T is a national company. TCI is only regional with about 18 million homes passed. So AT&T clearly couldn't stop with TCI if it was going to build out a national footprint to enter the local telephone markets. Thus, AT&T pursued a number of resale deals with other cable companies. Their inability to pursue those deals effectively was what drove the company ultimately to try to merge with Media One, which is pending currently. Media One happens to be a small company, but it is the key in many ways to AT&T's consolidation of a near nationwide footprint. That's why the company was willing to overpay for Media One, in our opinion. So point one in all of this is that in reality, if what you're after is local telecom competition, there's only one company that will conceivably bring it to you, because there's only one company incented properly to do so, and that's AT&T with the cable telephone strategy. Now, what's all that got to do with broadband and open cable? Well, the answer is everything. Because when you buy a cable company, if you're AT&T, if you spend $3,300 or $3,400 per subscriber, then you pay $150 or $200 per home pass to upgrade to two-way, and then you pay $500 on average per home over the next few years to add telecom electronics, to add an actual customer. There is no way that you're going to get a return on capital just by getting hold of telephone and basic cable revenues. There's no way to do it. The only way that you're going to get a return on capital, and therefore the only reason you're going to go forward with the strategy and invest, is if you are able to turn the platform into a broadband platform for multiple services, including high-speed data. Excuse me, and that's exactly what AT&T is attempting to do. Parenthetically, there are analysts on Wall Street currently who believe that AT&T will not even be able to drive an adequate return even with high-speed data and everything that they're involved in. So I think that the reality here that you're facing is a policy question, not a narrow legal argument. If you want to attain to local telecom competition, the only company that is going to do it for you, because they're the only one incented, is AT&T. The only way they're going to be properly incented, because the only way they'll ever have a chance of getting return on capital, is if they are incented properly in the broadband space as well. As investors and as an advisor to investors, the first thing that any investor would do is to attempt to deny capital to AT&T in its strategy if we believe that there was uncertainty as to its ability to get a return on that capital. The open cable issue, from my standpoint, is a policy issue which creates more uncertainty around this build-out, and therefore I would be the first one to take away my buy recommendation on AT&T if I believe that the actual economic outcome is going to be an uncertain one. Now, there are some concerns that other companies have. From AOL's perspective, won't they get crushed if they get denied access on demand to the broadband platform on cable? So point one there, I would say, is that AOL has, I think, 16 million customers at last count. Cable has 800,000, so they don't seem to be in imminent danger of being wiped out. Two, the company has successfully negotiated resale deals for broadband ADSL deployment with 2 RBOCs, and I think more deals are pending. So wherever the RBOCs are able to go, AOL will be able to go. And 3, Wall Street analysts like myself are all pushing companies like AT&T to negotiate with AOL because that's the smartest thing that they can do for a number of reasons. Now, from the RBOC perspective, there's another issue. DSL has been around for a long time. The RBOCs didn't ever begin really pushing it aggressively until now. Why is that? Because cable is building out now. The other issue is that since the RBOCs only reach 40 to 50% of their homes with DSL for a number of reasons, they're going to have to spend somewhere on order of magnitude $10 billion more to get ubiquity. Why would they want to deploy capital to do that? Simple, because cable is doing the same thing. So in my opinion, just to finish up, the real issue here is where do you want the competition and do you want it? Cable will build out because they are incented to build out. If they lose the incentive, they won't build out. If they don't build out, the RBOCs won't build out. So essentially, I think what you're faced with is a policy choice between robust competition and 2 pipes into the home, plus all the other pipes being developed, or effectively no pipes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Jacobs. Mr. Kimmelman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On behalf of Consumers Union, I want to thank you, Mr. Conyers, members of the committee, for inviting us. I want to particularly thank you for setting up the panel this way. I know it's unwieldy for the members to have this larger panel, but it truly is a democratizing process to have all the points of view present. So I commend you for structuring the hearing this way. I want to take the opportunity, it doesn't happen very often, to indicate that I agree with virtually everything Mr. Barr said. We haven't often been on the same side of issues. And I find it a unique opportunity to hear Mr. Jacobs buy and sell advice at a Judiciary Committee hearing. That certainly is not the norm. And I concur in what Mr. said at a Judiciary Committee hearing. That certainly is not the norm. And I concur in what Mr. Jacobs described as what appears to be what happened with AT&T. But I must indicate to you from a consumer perspective, there really is something wrong, something fundamentally wrong when you boil it down and say that you have to be able, in order for cable companies, whether owned by AT&T or anyone else, to move into new markets, to price gouge cable customers or overcharge for high-speed internet access. And there is something equally wrong if a local phone company, in order to expand into new markets, has to say, oops, we can't stand by those obligations in a law passed 3 years ago for opening up our networks to local telephone competition, which is, I believe, what many of you believe that whole law was an exercise designed to accomplish. We've heard this morning a lot of very, very eloquent yammering about competition and billions of dollars in capital. But there is something really, really wrong when 6 of the 8 large telephone companies are allowed by our antitrust officials to consolidate into 2 companies, together serving about 2/3 of all consumers, and through AT&T's acquisitions, cable companies united, 1 company serving almost 60% of all cable customers, where we've consolidated to a few groups of companies dominating these vital markets. And there's something even more wrong when, on the dollar side for the consumers, you see $3 or $4 billion of excess charges a year by cable companies above competitive pricing, and you see $5 billion in new charges on people's phone bills since the Telecom Act was passed. So we believe it is time to revisit this law for consumers, to seek modifications in the law, to stop these inappropriate rate hikes, and to correct what's going wrong. I would suggest one very simple principle, a consumer principle for you as you consider this legislation. We believe we need comparable public obligations for the transmission of the most important telecommunications, cable, television, internet services until vibrant competition develops throughout the market, not just for high-end customers, but throughout the market for all consumers. So we look very favorably on the portions of the Goodlatte-Boucher legislation that would subject the cable wire to comparable obligations to the telephone wire, and we believe that there is more that can be done to ensure fair pricing of cable services and high-speed internet access. On the other hand, we do have considerable concerns about the provisions in the legislation that we fear could enable local phone companies to circumvent many of the obligations in the 96 Act related to opening up their markets to local competition. I think Mr. Salisbury stated it quite succinctly and with the appropriate analysis. So we look forward to working with the committee, with the sponsors of the legislation, to improve this legislation to make sure it meets consumers' needs. And most importantly, we urge this committee to act to begin addressing the problems with the 96 Act. Please don't wait. With prices going up and up and up, and consolidation gobbling up virtually every potential competitor in sight around these industries, we cannot afford to wait longer to address consumers' needs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kimmelman. And before we go into the questions, I would like to make a prayerful suggestion that we be mindful of a 5-minute limit. We have many members here who want to participate, and if you spend your 5 minutes making a statement and then at the expiration ask a long, convoluted question, then you have euchred us out of 10 minutes at least. And so, again, I appeal to the judgment of each member to remember they have 5 minutes, and I will try to cut you off at the end of 5 minutes, only so we can have maximum participation. Mr. Conyers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank all the witnesses. I don't think anybody on this committee would try to double 5 minutes into 10 minutes, but I'm glad you made that observation anyway. Gentlemen, there are some problems here that maybe we'll need more than 5 minutes around. We may need several rounds of 5 minutes to get at. Because Mr. Vraedenberg went to great pains to assure me that if it's competition and consumers protection that I want, that his approach and this bill's approach is the best. I remain skeptical after having listened to all 11, 12. Mr. Kimmelman leaves me almost in a state of mild shock, but that we can go into later. The point here is twofold, and I'm going to direct these comments for as much as my 5 minutes will go to Mr. Jacobs and Mr. Salisbury and Mr. Boggs. Isn't it true that, first of all, 271 is going to be compromised? Isn't it also true that we should give enforcement a chance before we start legislating? And how do we have to pass this bill to get to the equality and the fairness in the marketplace, and yet give the consumers a shot, which they are not getting now? And there you have it, and let's go at it as quickly as we can.
Okay, thank you, Congressman Conyers. Let me just very quickly respond that from MCI WorldCom's perspective, this is not a good deal. Trading the clear protection of saying that the RBOCs have to open their networks before they could enter these markets, as opposed to having the opportunity to sue them later on if they do something wrong. That's a bad deal for consumers. And I'd also say, that, so I agree with what you said, Congressman, but I would also say that what we are seeing now is we are on the verge of having the benefits of 271 and the Telecom Act being achieved, and it would be a particularly inopportune time now, I think, to legislate.
Mr. Jacobs.
Thank you. When you mentioned 271 being compromised, I assume you mean if the RBOCs are allowed to do data transport across LATA boundaries. In the written testimony I submitted, I put in 2 exhibits on the very last page, and these summarize our opinion about what the growth in the industry is going to be over the next 5 years. What you'll see there is that if you actually look at what's driving growth in the telecom industry in general, 60% of that growth in the next 5 years is going to come out of data and internet products, whereas voice is going to drive very, very little growth at all. Now, when you then look in more detail at what's going on with inter-LATA services, you've got voice services, data services, and internet services. If you look there, 85% of the growth in all inter-LATA services is going to be driven by data and internet products, with only 15% of the growth coming out of voice products in the next 5 years. So the question is, what are the RBOCs really after in getting inter-LATA? Now, yes, you want to get in the voice business even though it's not growing because it's large, but if you want to talk about getting a piece of the growth, that's really the data products. So my question to you is, again, from a policy standpoint, if what you're after is trying to incent the RBOCs to open their markets, then the question is, do you want to open them up to 85% of the growth in the market without having to do so first? That would be my point on that.
Tim Boggs, last sentence.
I'll try to answer your concern about consumers, which I think really goes to the choice question. And if we are concerned here today about the viability of DSL, the reality of opportunities for consumers to choose different options for broadband, different from cable, I would point to 3 developments in the last week, just 3 comments in the last week. One, the Chief Technology Officer of AOL gave a speech in which he pointed to his expectation, a strong expectation, that consumers will face a blend of broadband opportunities, cable, DSL, and wireless. And he's putting his money where his mouth is. They've invested in the latter 2, and they intend to see them happen. Secondly, today, page 1, column 1 in the New York Times reports on the SBC deal with the FCC that permits them to acquire Ameritech. In the conditions of that deal, SBC, a company of market capitalization of $180 billion, has agreed to set up a separate subsidiary that will offer DSL aggressively to customers, has embraced that business plan. They're not goofing around in their markets. We feel them breathing down our necks. Thirdly, again, to quote Commissioner Powell, at the FCC, a thoughtful guy who's looked really carefully at this. He doesn't see that there's any doubt that this is a vibrant and competitive market. And in his speech on June 15th to a bar association, he lays out his view of that. It's a dynamic speech. I'll send you all a copy of it because he's right on target. This is a competitive market. Consumers are going to have choice.
I thank you all.
Mr. Geekus.
I thank the chair. It seems that every time we turn around these days, particularly in our committee, we have problems revolving around the role of the FCC in 100 different ways, including antitrust, merger, a whole host of things. And I've been personally dissatisfied with the inability to reach conclusions about it. I'd like to try to reach a conclusion today on the role of the FCC in the current situation, which prompts the gentleman from Virginia on my right and on my left to proceed along these lines. General Barr, could you apprise me of what role does the FCC now play in your view hindering or putting hurdles in the way of the Boucher-Goodlatte approaches?
I think the FCC is contributing to the obstacles for competition in the internet right now. Let me portray it this way. Telephone companies have a traditional market that they're serving. It's about a $100 billion market, and its share of telecommunications is rapidly declining. Cable has a $60+ billion market. But we've both evolved to be able to serve a third and different market, and that's the Internet. The Internet is probably around $1 trillion market in the near future. MCI's own vice chairman says that by 2004, 99% of telecommunications is going to be Internet. Telephony will be 1%. So we started off as a penguin in our telephone market. They started off as an ostrich in their cable market, but we've evolved into ducks on the Internet. And we want more ducks. That's what this is all about. What the FCC has done is it said, we're not going to let the telephone companies be ducks. We're going to use this as an opportunity to take the old telephone regulations and apply them to the Internet. And so you cannot compete on an even footing on the Internet with the cable companies. But then they turn around and say to the cable companies, oh, this is something different than cable. Even though you have open access rules that apply to you, that were supposed to design to have diversity of programming, we're going to let you evade those open access rules because we're now going to call this Internet. So you have this gross disparity of treatment, which is frustrating the ability of the only other competitor out there, the telephone companies, to come in and deploy high bandwidth.
So that when Mr. Goodlatte in his bill actually mandates that the Commission will have no authority with respect to this, that it amounts to deregulation that would take the FCC out of the open access question.
Absolutely. And let me just make a comment about this argument on 271. It presents a very flat policy decision for this Congress. Yes, in our old market, we're still functioning as a telephone company on our public switch network, and we're prohibited by the bill from getting into long-distance voice. And we still have those obligations, and we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars to try to retrofit our system so that instead of serving one, it can serve many suppliers. That, however, is a dwindling market with a which the long-distance companies say themselves is going to be 1% of telecommunications by 2004. And the issue you have to face is to get an extra ounce of leverage to open up this increasingly niche market and get the maximum leverage to have open access here on the old telephony business. You're going to sacrifice competition in the telecommunications market of the 21st century, which is going to be 98% of telecommunications. So let the cable guys, run wild with the Internet. Let them forget about open access, because we want to impose the ultimate pressure on the telephone companies to put in open access on the telephone side. Open access is coming on the telephone side. But what can't wait is getting that open access rule today in place on the Internet. You heard them say, you have to have open access to begin with. You can't rely on litigation after the fact, and we agree. You got to have an open access rule on the Internet. Let's not make the same mistake with the Internet we made with telephone and cable.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my non-time.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Berman.
The gentleman from California, may I make a unanimous consent request?
Surely.
That members of the panel be allowed to submit questions in writing. Many of us, I think, have to leave before we'll have a chance to do questioning, and then include those questions and answers in the record.
You mean members of the committee?
Members of the committee, yes.
Would like to submit questions? Surely, without objection. Mr. Berman.
Mr. Cleveland, you said the nature of investments will shift if we pass this bill. How will they shift?
Well, right now, the marketplace has three basic assumptions about the cable industry, and that is, number one, they have the best broadband pipe into the home for data and for video. The second assumption is that they're not going to be open for competition, and the third assumption is that they are going to be able to leverage that power unfettered by any government enforcement. And so the marketplace right now, I think, assumes that cable is a high-growth monopoly, and it doesn't get any better than that. So that's the marketplace perception right now. They don't believe that the Goodlatte-Boucher bill will have a chance of passing, or that the regulators will ultimately open. And so they see a very rosy outlook. And that if there is access required, there probably would be some type of pullback because those assumptions would be proven to be faulty.
So that the opponents of that part of Goodlatte-Boucher are correct when they say this will hurt investment in us, but your argument would be is that they have an unfair advantage at this point. And so, yes, it'll hurt, but it'll hurt because it'll equalize things.
Well, what it is it will shift. In the sentence right now is investment is encouraged by cable operators right now. It is not encouraged by internet or electronic commerce players. So in a choice right now, we have a policy that encourages investment by the very few and powerfully discourages investment by the world.
On the issue of the world that Mr. Jacobs describes, where only AT&T can provide the real competition for local phone service. I wonder, how does that make Mr. Windhausen feel? Or I guess maybe Mr. Salisbury, since I understand part of your company is also getting into all of this. By the way, as you get into this and you chip away at this market share, is there anything that obligates you to provide access to all internet service providers?
Well, first off, Mr. Berman, you're correct to Mr. Jacobs' statement that only AT&T is going to be able to be a competitor. Did not make me feel very good. I represent a lot of companies who are out there competing in that marketplace today. AT&T is certainly a very vibrant and strong competitor, but we have a lot of companies that can go toe-to-toe with AT&T in that local marketplace and are doing that today. Your substantive question about any obligations that we encounter, all of our companies are common carriers. And that means that we have an obligation to serve the public and provide transmission for whatever traffic it is that consumers want to put on our systems.
And this would be true in DSL as well as in
That's correct. That's correct. DSL is just one of many data services that are out there, voice and data and video services that are on our network, and we provide service to any comer who wishes to put traffic on our network. We're more than happy to do so, and we're legally obligated to do so.
I guess my last question, we've heard very little talk, just a brief reference at the end to the whole issue of the satellite role in internet, and we did notice the AOL investment, and is this the third way? Is this tell us what the implications of this are in terms of broadband and quick communication, speedy passage of data.
I think, Mr. Berman, that under the current state of technologies, satellite has got a somewhat a clever hybrid capability, that is fast download speeds, but a telephone return path that does not represent a true two-way capability like is potentially available on DSL and cable. I think that potential true two-way capability off the satellite is probably 4 to 5 years away in the consumer marketplace. So I think that it provides a good but not fully comparable service, particularly to rural areas and other areas that may not be served effectively in the near term by DSL and cable modems. And I think in the longer term there is a real prospect in 4 to 5 years, which is of course the entire history of the internet to date, but in 4 or 5 years that there'll be a two-way capability from the satellite.
Mr. Goodlatte.
Mr. Chairman, can I just add one point that I think of very much use to the committee? And that is in the chart that is at the end of my testimony, we show when the whole broadband market, essentially the wireline, wireless, and satellite, and it shows what the opportunities are, where the subscribers are, and when and where it'll be available, and that answers your question, and also shows us how fast the pipes are and how much they cost. It's on one page. It's a very useful summary to get a big picture of what's going on.
Thank you very much.
You,
Mr. Goodlatte.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to commend all of the witnesses today for their contribution. I think this has been an excellent debate and discussion. Mr. Rosenblum, I particularly want to welcome AT&T, and I want to make it clear that I welcome AT&T's investment in rolling out broadband services. I think it's a tremendous opportunity, and I want to see your company and others continue to do that. But I'm very concerned about the model that I perceive that you're utilizing. For years, AT&T has been up here on Capitol Hill telling us that local telephone companies should open their lines to foster competition. So how can you come up here today with a straight face and tell us that we should deny, that you should have the right to deny access to internet service provider competitors, in fact attempting to destroy competition in the internet service market?
Congressman, obviously, I understand the question and sort of expected it, but to be honest with you, I think there's a huge difference between what we are trying to do and what the incumbent telephone companies are doing. In general, we have always come before the Congress arguing for competition and market forces. In the case of the incumbent local telephone companies in the 1996 Telecom Act, Congress made a judgment which we heartily endorse, that because of the 100-year monopoly history of the local telephone business and the absolute importance to consumers of getting competition going in that market, a special set of rules and tools would be applied to those companies, requiring them to unbundle, requiring them to provide access, at least until competition could develop, and market forces would then take over to assure that consumers get choices.
Mr. Rosenblum, cable has not been around as long as telephone has, but as long as it's been around, in almost every community in this country that it exists as a monopoly. So why should there be a distinction between the access to your lines, which you want to have an exclusive bundling right, and they don't? They have to open their lines up to America Online. They have to open their lines up to Roanoke.com, a small internet service provider owned by a local newspaper in my district, or thousands of other internet service providers around the country. You want to have a completely different model where you say, you want our high-speed access to the internet, which is 50 times faster than what they can offer. Great. You also have to buy our internet service provider service at home. Why should you be treated differently when you come up here constantly? And in fact, you're really arguing the same thing today with regard to the phone companies. Don't cut them loose. Don't let them compete. Make them do certain things to open up their lines, but don't make us do it. How do you defend that?
Well, Congressman, let me defend it on two levels. First, I think it is not the case today that we are providing a closed platform, nor do we ever want to provide a closed platform. I think, as Mr. Boggs pointed out, and as I tried to in my comments, anyone who uses these at-home or Roadrunner services today can get onto the internet without any restriction or limitation, and from the internet get anywhere the internet can take you.
But you have to pay extra, right?
Well, you have to pay extra if someone else puts a website up that charges money. Some content providers like AOL have established websites that charge for access. Other providers like Yahoo have websites that don't charge for access. It's really up to the internet provider who establishes a website to determine whether that charge is imposed. As Mr. Boggs also said, our customers can and do design the service.
But website operators are not necessarily internet service providers. And if you want to be an internet service provider and compete head-to-head with at home, you've got to compete at the disadvantage of telling your customers that you've got to pay extra to do it if you're going to do it on the cable system, which is completely different than the narrow band because it's 50 times faster.
Well, Congressman, I understand the point. Right now, there are literally thousands of internet service providers of all sizes and shapes and descriptions. What they all seem to have in common is that they rely 97 to 98% on narrowband dial-up access. A point that really shouldn't get lost here is that when we succeed in deploying a telephony capability over this cable platform we're investing in, that will allow customers to have an additional choice of narrowband dial-up access. And that, like Mr. Windhausen's clients, will also be a common carrier service that will give customers choice of all ISPs, and they will also, for the first time, have this high-speed broadband choice. But let me step back a little bit, because I said there were two levels on which I wanted to defend this. And AT&T really is kind of a latecomer to the cable industry. And we see it a little bit differently. We don't view this as a cable business or a monopoly. We see a cable industry and a telephone industry that have spent many, many years assiduously not competing in each other's businesses.
Mr. Rosenblum, my time is running out rapidly. Let me just say that I understand why you would not want to see this as a monopoly. I hope you understand why a great many people in this room do see it as a monopoly, and why the access to it being denied to open competition, which the phone companies are required to provide, and I think has spurred the growth of the Internet, has a very different tenor than when you come here and say, well, it's really not a monopoly. It is a monopoly in terms of the access that you have and the bundling that you are attempting to do when you say that other folks can't get on the line with you. You're denying consumers choices when you say they've got to pay extra to get somebody else's service. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Boucher, I'm sorry, Mr. Rosenblum. Mr. Boucher.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I also want to commend all of the witnesses who have spoken with us this morning for their very thoughtful and carefully prepared statements. I think this has been a truly excellent opening discussion on the major policy challenges that confront the Internet today. Mr. Barr, I'd like to give you an opportunity in the time that I have, limited as it is, to respond to the statements that were made by a number of the witnesses this morning objecting to the provisions in Mr. Goodlatte's and my legislation that would create more competition in the offering of backbone services by enabling the Bell operating companies to offer data across LATA boundaries, even in advance of getting permission under Section 271 of the '96 Act to offer all services, including voice-based long distance, across LATA boundaries. And as you answer that, let me just suggest a couple of areas where I think some information might be helpful. First of all, I'm a representative of a rural district, and there are many parts of rural America, including my district, where it is frankly awkward to provide backbone services because of these inter-LATA restrictions. How could the ability of Bell operating companies to deliver data across LATA boundaries promote more affordable backbone services and therefore more affordable Internet access in rural America? Secondly, describe for us, if you would, the way in which a concentration in the ownership of the Internet backbone could threaten the peering arrangements that keep Internet traffic flowing for free and without charge among the various segments of the backbone, and how our provision is an answer to that challenge. If you would also, please talk about how this provision is entirely consistent with our intent in passing the 1996 Act, since we accept from this services across LATA boundaries that are voice-based traditional long distance. And then finally, if you would, comment on how you can segregate for purposes of enforcing our restriction on the offering of voice-based long distance until Section 271 approval is obtained, the data traffic on the one hand and the voice-based long distance traffic on the other. There's an easy way to do it. We'd like your description.
Starting with the last part of your question, the Goodlatte-Boucher bill continues to enforce 271 requirements. But what it does, and this is very important, is it does segregate out the traditional telephone market from the Internet market. And it says that the telephone companies cannot sell voice-only products over the Internet. So it keeps that cabining of these two markets. Then it brings competition into the Internet market. Now, this is very important for people to understand, because the heart of competition on the backbone, on the Internet, is multiplicity of backbone providers. There are only two kinds of communication systems you can have. You can either have a monopoly that achieves ubiquity, or you can have a network of networks. Think about the post office. How do I make sure that I can communicate and send a letter to anybody in the world or anyone in the United States? You have one monopoly. Okay. The other way to do it is have multiplicity of providers. But if you do that, then they have to have agreements to transfer the traffic back and forth, the mail. And they have to have the incentive to do that. If one of them gets too large, or if that market gets too concentrated, then they can close off that market and prevent other players from playing. Just think if there were one big 60% post office and then three or four 10%, and that 60% post office said, I'm going to stop delivering mail to you guys. Everyone would then shift over to the big post office. This is the dynamic behind and the need to have many backbones, and this was the whole vision of the Internet. Well, I'll tell you what. Because of the restrictions on the bulk of the industry, the local companies from coming in and providing backbone service on the Internet, we've gone from 30 to 5. And guess who the top 3 are? The IXCs. And there are, therefore, a lot of communities are not being served with backbone. For example, the whole state of West Virginia doesn't have a POP in it. The way to get competition on the backbone is to allow the RBOCs into that business, allow them to carry that traffic. And then you will get more competition in the backbone, and that empowers every single level of the Internet to have more competition.
Mr. Hutchinson. I'm sorry, Mr. Shabbat. I didn't see you down there.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Vraedenberg, if broadband access is truly an essential facility, then shouldn't a garden variety lawsuit brought under Section 2 of the Sherman Act solve the problem?
I think, Congressman, that in fact what we're confronted here with is a broader question about exactly how government policy in this area is going to be across these platforms. It does seem to me that we have a demonstrated example in the Internet of how openness has worked, and I think it's quick and easy to extend that. We are not personally sort of in the litigation game. I mean, AT&T has warned us that, in fact, they may be in the litigation game. We have not been in the litigation game. We think that this Congress ought to address this question quickly in a non-regulatory mode with a quick and simple solution to the problem by taking litigation out of the game and the uncertainty associated with that over a number of years.
Do you, you're not saying, or are you, do you think antitrust laws, do you think they function properly? Do you think they need to be changed? If that's not your view of antitrust laws, why are you seeking legislation that would actually amend the Sherman Act?
Well, Congressman, as we've indicated, we think that the Antitrust Act in its broad constitutional kind of scope is certainly adequate in the general proposition, but that in fact here we have a very precise question and a very precise problem, and I think a fairly simple and clear answer. This is a situation where the problem is big enough to be identified, but still small enough to be solved. If one waited for several years for a piece of antitrust litigation to wend its way through the court and then tried to address whatever the outcome of that by whoever lost that lawsuit with legislation at that time, we would have passed this problem. I think the inevitable consequence of Congress not acting quickly and addressing this thing in a straightforward manner, as Congressmen Goodlatte and Boucher have done, is that there will be continued consolidation around the wireline owners, continued acquisitions by AT&T and in the cable industry, continued consolidation in the telephone industry, and we won't have competition for the Internet that in fact we'll be able to have if there's a quick, simple, deregulatory and non-regulatory solution as Congressman Goodlatte and Boucher have put forward.
By singling out Internet service providers as a protected class of entrepreneurs, won't the legislation generate momentum for other industries to seek special antitrust status?
Well, Congressman, I think what this bill does is try to set out as a protected class consumers. Because what this will do is to permit every Internet service provider, whether it be cable-owned, telephone company-owned, or independent of either of the wireline carriers, to be able to access every customer, and for every customer in this country who is interested in broadband, high-speed Internet service to access every supplier. And in that instance, it does seem to me that the solution is straightforward and quick, non-regulatory, and in fact will protect consumers, not any particular player. If one looks at the world today and said, who is the protected class of companies here, look at AT&T's position. AT&T is in the long-distance business and, in fact, is protected by existing laws from any competition from the local telephone companies. And on the other side, AT&T, now entering the cable business, is protected by the government in its monopoly status. So right at the moment, if there is a protected class of persons, indeed person, for the existing structure In the asymmetrical structure of the regulatory system, it is one company. It's AT&T.
Mr. Chairman, it's already been said, but I think it bears, I got a little bit of time, so it bears saying it again, that I think this panel on both sides, all sides, has been particularly enlightening here this morning, and I think all have done a very good job in espousing their point of view. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Scott, the gentleman from Virginia.
You indicated that if you sign up for cable access, that you could get AOL.
Yes, sir.
Do you get automatically Roadrunner service?
Yes, sir.
Is there a separate charge for Roadrunner?
No, sir. If you'd like, I could go through the charges that are charged.
I mean, I'm with another cable service, and you get at home with that service. Now, what's wrong with a separate charge for Roadrunner? And can you get Roadrunner through the telephone high-speed access line?
The architecture that we have used for this system is designed to try to meet the mix of needs that a consumer in a particular community places on us. Remember, first, it's primarily a video service. Congress has pressed us to have a reliable and efficient video service that doesn't present some of the complaints of the past. Secondly, we are charged by our shareholders and by Congress to some extent with trying to provide telephone service over this same network. We are certainly encouraged by you and Congress to provide high-definition television and digital television. So the capacity of this plant that we've built for this community is limited. It has some limits placed on it. We have designed it in such a way that we believe it can handle all of the traffic of the customers of that community, of all neighborhoods within the community, for high-speed internet access. We do not believe that the architecture will permit us in an efficient and effective way to open up the plant for interconnections right at the head end of the cable system. However, every customer, by using the internet, can bypass us entirely, can take all of the Time Warner content and just shove it and ignore it and go exactly to wherever they want to go.
The point has been made that if there's not a separate charge for it, you get it, and if you wanted another service, you'd have to pay for that extra.
Only if the other service provider chooses to charge you for it. But there are many, much of the internet is for free, of course.
But is there any prohibition, is there any reason why you can't have a separate charge that you could avoid if you don't want Roadrunner?
If you think of Roadrunner as both a content and a facility, the content is frankly minimal and it has little cost associated with it. The expense to us is the building out of this network, maintaining the servers to keep it. Think of Roadrunner as an access.
You can't do a separate charge for Roadrunner?
No, sir.
Okay. This area is, I don't know who this is going to be aimed at, but we have a quick changing technology that requires a lot of research and development investments. In the pharmaceutical area, the way we encourage that investment is to give someone the absolute right to benefit from their investment for 17 years. At the end of 17 years, anybody can copy it and use it. And that is supposed to be in the best interest of the consumer. How does allowing someone who did not make the research and development investment get into the telephone or cable benefit, how does that encourage a long-term investment in this area? And whether or not the consumer is better off or worse off if you allow people who did not make the investment to get into the, to benefit from the investment.
If I could just jump in, I just want to say that I don't think anyone is talking about not allowing people to charge a fair price for use of their facilities. The issue is whether you have the ability to prevent others from having equal access to consumers or consumers to have equal access to different vendors. I don't think there's any question about anyone being denied a fair return on their investment.
Can I respond to that? Because it's the same as the separate price issue that you asked, which is the investment is in the local transport, and there's no question they're going to get paid for it no matter who uses it. The question is whether they can then leverage from that and say, by the way, Merck has developed this drug for cancer, and by the way, if you want to get treated for cancer and want the drug, you also have to go to hospitals in which we have a financial interest. There's no question they're going to get paid for the drug. They'll get paid for the local transport, no matter who uses it. We're willing to pay them the full cost of using that local transport.
Can I offer an additional word? About 40-50% of our costs, Congressman, are payments for infrastructure. That is, of the $21.95, a significant portion of that we pay to a variety of long lease line carriers and to the ILACs for business lines or to CLACs. So we are significantly every year paying billions of dollars for infrastructure costs. What will help us drive costs down and consumer prices down is if we have competition in that infrastructure. And the only way to do that, since if we go out today and say we want some high-speed lines, we can go get DSL lines, we can get to the marketplace. But if we can get DSL lines and cable lines competitive with each other, we can drive down those local transport costs, drive down our costs, drive down costs to consumers. But at the moment, we don't have any competition in that last mile. We think we can get it with the Goodlatte-Boucher bill because that would mean that cable will sell us transport lines, telephone companies will sell us transport lines, we can acquire them elsewhere, terrific, but in the end we get some competition in that last mile facility.
Mr. Hutchinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope I can get 3 questions in. Let me start with Mr. Jacobs. Mr. Salisbury testified, I'll read his statement and ask you to respond to it. He testified that the real problem is that 3 years after the fact, the local markets for voice and data services are not yet open. The solution to that very real problem is vigorous enforcement of the laws, not new legislation. Is the problem the RBOX and their failure to open up the local markets, or is the problem the FCC?
I think that the problem has been that the RBOX have perceived it for some period of time not to truly be in their interest to proactively open up. If you look at what happened when the FCC tried to push UniP, now without talking about whether UniP is reasonable or not reasonable, one thing about UniP, and again that's the highly discounted form of resale, that was going to incent MCI, Sprint, and AT&T all to attack the residential and the business markets. The RBOX went to court to stop that because they believed it wasn't in their interest to open up the markets in that way.
How are they doing now on it?
Excuse me?
How are they doing now?
Well, now things have changed because now that AT&T is pursuing its strategy rather vigorously, having already, proposed to invest more than $100 billion in addition to all the cost of upgrades, et cetera, now the RBOX are pushing quite aggressively to get their long-distance deals done, and it's only within that context that UniP has, again, arisen. It's arisen in New York State, where Bell Atlantic agreed to do UniP, and that's why MCI is serving the residential markets.
Thank you. Second question to Mr. Barr. In your testimony, you indicated that if the existing interlatteral restrictions did not apply to IP data, the Bells would be able to bring high-speed internet access to rural areas much sooner. And today in the Arkansas Democrat Gazette, it indicated that GTE is selling 213,000 phone lines in Arkansas at $843 million. And it goes on and comments that GTE, like other major telephone companies, is shedding its less profitable rural customers and concentrating on business, data services, internet, and so on to urban customers. How is this going to help the rural customers, and how does your selling vacating the lines in Arkansas, what does it portend for the future if you have this kind of access that you want?
The sale off of some of our rural properties, we're still preponderantly a rural and suburban company. We only have 2 downtown areas. But that sell-off is because of FCC policies that are not providing for universal service payments. We're expected to serve rural areas below cost, but part of that quid pro quo was that we would get paid out of a universal service fund, the difference. That is being taken away from us and hasn't been replaced. The Telecom Act said they had to do it very quickly, and they've already postponed doing any universal service reform till the 2000s. That's a different issue, but look at the financial incentives for a telephone company versus AT&T. We agree on something very fundamental. which is you cannot get a financial return if you can only look to the local transport revenues. You can't get a financial return. So what's their solution? Their solution is you have to let us mandatorily capture all the vertical stream of revenues. Lock in the customer, give them no choice, get all those ISP revenues, lock in all the backbone revenues. Over on the telephone side, though, we are required to look just to the local revenues by the FCC, and to go to Congressman Scott's point, the FCC has promulgated rules that if we make an investment, we have to turn it over to competitors at steep discounts. In fact, they just came out and said SBC has to turn over ADSL at a 50% discount to competitors. Those are massive burdens.
Are you saying that if this legislation passed, you would have a greater incentive to invest in the rural areas?
You could make money by building ADSL and also by transporting that data. That's exactly what AT&T is saying. The only difference is we're saying we don't have to lock our customers in. We don't have to guarantee ourselves those revenues. What we want to do is compete. Let everyone compete at every level, including us.
Is that a yes?
Yes.
Thanks. That's all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Watt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am reminded of a comment that I made to some of my lawyer friends about the difference between practicing law and being in Congress. And my response to them was, in a trial, you never ask a question you don't know the answer to. I get to ask questions I don't know, even if the question makes sense, much less know the answer to. So I'm going to ask one here. It always seems to me to be questionable. I'm not saying I'm not on one side or the other of this issue, but it seems to me to always be questionable to change a legal standard that has been out there for a long, long time. And it seems to me that going back to these bills, that's what we're doing. We're changing a presumption in the law that might or might not be justifiable. The question I have is there such a changed presumption? Would there be such a changed presumption if we were talking about AT&T getting access to DSL? What is the law? I don't even know what DSL is, but I take it that that's the competitor to what we're here talking about. And it seems to me if it's fair to give this presumption insofar as broadband is concerned, it would be fair to give the presumption insofar as DSL is concerned. I have no idea whether such a presumption exists one way or another, but perhaps I could hear from, let's see, we had a couple of lawyers on this panel. I could hear from Mr. Barr on it, and then I can hear from, who's my lawyer on the other side? Mr. Rosenblum. Give me your take on that, Mr. Barr, and then I'll hear from Mr. Rosenblum on the other side.
Both under existing law and under the Goodlatte-Boucher bill, telephone companies, when they install the gizmos that create ADSL, which is the high-speed service, have to make those available to competitors, including AT&T. So AT&T, there are two kinds of open access. One is the kind we're asking for them to engage in. It's called, I would call it open access light, which is at least just deliver the traffic to other people, okay? We have to do that. But we also have an open access requirement. I call it open access heavy. We have to sell it to our...
You're answering a policy question. I'm asking a legal question.
We have the obligation.
You've got an obligation, but is there a presumption if you don't do it are you presumed to be in violation of the Sherman antitrust law?
That was the whole presumption in the Telecom Act of 1996.
Is there comparable language?
Yes, in this statute there is. We're under the same, in the Goodlatte bill, we are subject to the same presumption.
Let me hear from you.
I respectfully disagree with Mr. Barr.
Rosenblum, I'm sorry, I've been mispronouncing.
Congressman, I answer to just about anything. That's just fine. There is no presumption of antitrust violation that attaches when telephone companies don't live up to their obligations under the Telecommunications Act, and I would respectfully submit that's been a very good thing for the incumbent local telephone companies. I think, as a number of the witnesses have discussed today, there has been a 3-year history of these companies not living up to their obligations under the Telecommunications Act, and there is no presumption of an antitrust violation that applies in that case. What concerns us about this legislation, exactly as you've identified it, is it does change established laws by creating presumptions of antitrust violations that may not make a lot of sense, but normally in an antitrust case, you first look to see whether there is a relevant market, whether customers have substitute products or services. All of that would be wiped off the books, frankly, under the legislation, and a presumption of a violation would apply merely because a single broadband provider didn't offer the same terms for interconnection to one ISP. And that's our biggest concern with the antitrust provisions.
Thank you, Mr. White.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Cannon, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, there are some different views here. Let me just start out by saying that I am almost ecstatic at the fact that we're having this debate and that the state of competition has got us to the point where we're actually talking about these issues here. I'd like to ask a few questions, so if the panelists could keep relatively to the point, I'd appreciate it. Mr. Vraedenberg, your company's CEO, speaking in support of the Internet Tax Freedom Act, said last fall that it would be a big mistake to have 30,000 taxing jurisdictions impose their own laws, rules, and rates on the Internet. Why then does AOL believe that it would make sense to have a similar number of jurisdictions impose open access schemes on the cable industry?
Congressman, we have advocated, as you know, a open access regime publicly. And in fact, we would hope that an open access regime would be adopted as a national policy. Failing any national leadership on this subject, it is clear that consumers out there, reflecting their views as citizens, are urging cities to take a hold of this issue because they're not getting any response out of Washington, and they want choice and competition in their cable services.
Thank you. Mr. Jacobs, your firm has suggested that if the cable industry does not build out its broadband pipeline, the RBOX likely will not meet the competitive challenge. Do you stand behind that assessment, and would the imposition of open cable obligations tend to retard cable's incentive to invest in these new broadband facilities?
Yes, the problem with open cable is that when you have the government stepping in to set the prices, you have total uncertainty and you don't necessarily have the capability to get a return on your invested capital. If you're not going to get a return, your shareholders won't let you invest. If you just look at the plain and simple fact, ADSL is only now being aggressively deployed, and furthermore, further investments are now being made by the RBOX to make it ubiquitous. I don't think the timing is totally coincidental that it's coming at the same time that cable is now just getting built out.
But it's thrilling that it's coming, I've got to say. That is thrilling from both sides. Mr. Cleland, I'm skeptical of the wisdom of any policy that seeks to increase the regulatory burden on new entrants, especially in an industry as complex as high-speed Internet access. Shouldn't our attention be focused instead on reducing regulatory burdens that prevent existing firms from competing in this marketplace? If you agree, what suggestions would you offer to this committee to help us eliminate burdensome and anti-competitive regulation in the area of high-speed Internet access?
Well, I think in general, we should be focusing on what the goal is, and that is a competitive, freely competitive, innovative marketplace. And deregulation is a very powerful tool that should be used aggressively in many instances. However, we also have a body of a century of antitrust law which says that there is something else to fear besides government regulation, and that is anti-competitive behavior by companies, by monopolies. And so there's a balance. I am very much a deregulatory type of person. Let the market work. However, in certain instances, small competitors can't compete unless the government enables it. John Windhausen's association would not be an association had the government not enabled the competitive local exchange industry to emerge in a local telco monopoly. The long-distance industry would not exist had not the government broken up AT&T. And so they're not mutually exclusive. You need to look at them in tandem.
Mr. Cullen, any legislation that mandates open access is unlikely to achieve that goal unless the law also requires that price and terms and other conditions of sale are reasonable. But that doesn't that just pave the way for intrusive and burdensome price regulation?
Thanks for asking that question, because everybody thinks that this leads to, down the line, to common carrier regulation. There's a very simple, non-regulatory solution, and that is have a one sentence that says, we need open access on a non-discriminatory basis. Now, if AT&T did that, it would have to have at-home be charged just like AOL, just like anybody else. AT&T would have complete freedom. If they wanted to set a $1,000 fee for everybody, they could. They wouldn't sell any DSL. But if they wanted to sell a $10 fee, everybody could get it on the exact same terms. That's the issue here, is they don't want to be able to, you shouldn't allow yourself to self-deal when you're a monopoly. If there's one price, everybody should have the same price.
The gentlelady from California, Ms. Lofgren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have found this panel to be very interesting, and I think all of us on both sides of the aisle agree that the best way to deploy broadband is to have vigorous competition, and the marketplace will deliver it. The only question is how to achieve that, and this has been a very interesting discussion. This morning, the San Jose Mercury News had an editorial on this subject, and I'd like to ask unanimous consent, if I may, Mr. Chairman, to make the editorial a part of the record.
Without objection.
They oppose the two bills that are the subject of this hearing, but do suggest that there is a middle ground that is reflected in the Los Angeles Information Technology Agency report that ought to be pursued at this time. Specifically, they suggest that subscribers to cable broadband should have unrestricted access to all content on the internet, that they should have the easy ability to choose their own home page, that there should be no time limits on downloading a video unless there's a capacity reason for such time limits, and that benchmarks ought to be set up for the FCC to consider so that down the line, I mean, right now cable has, what, 1% of the market? So to say that it is, you know, controlling the market is preposterous at 1%. But at some point, it could be a concern, and maybe we ought to set some benchmarks. I'm wondering, Mr. Jacobs, if you believe that kind of scheme would be a deterrent to the rollout of broadband through the cable industry.
I think it's not impossible to assume that that could be helpful. I actually find that I'm actually in agreement for once with the FCC in the way that they pursued this policy. I'm not usually necessarily in agreement with them. But what they've done in this policy is they've sort of fired a shot across the bow of cable. They've said, okay, you are incipient, you're brand new, we're going to give you a time to go and try and pursue your investments. But by the way, we always have the ability to come in and regulate you if you behave in the internet space the way you behaved in the programming space. Yeah. I think that that's a fairly prudent strategy, because you can always come in and regulate later. There's a legitimate concern that perhaps billions of dollars will be spent creating proprietary systems that you won't be able to go back and re-regulate later. And in fact, Mr. Barr has been one of the best proponents of showing that the systems are actually quite easy to open up. So in some sense, he's actually argued the cable argument on that one, which I find a bit ironic. But I think the point is that if it's in AT&T's and everybody else's interest to have as many people selling the service for them as possible. Negotiations, I believe, in the open marketplace will lead to that. If they don't, come back and regulate them in 2 or 3 years.
So it seems to me, as I listen to it, the question is not just of where we're going to end up, but also when we end up there. And I'm very cognizant in this issue, as with so many others, that we are very much in a transition phase. I mean, my friend John Doerr describes the internet as the Big Bang and says that we're at second 2 as it's, and I think that is very much a good analogy. And so what we do in this issue may just help for a short time, but it's not going to be the final answer of where we all are. And the real concern is not to misstep and to preclude the optimizing of opportunities through market forces, through a misreading of the market forces. I'm wondering, in terms of DSL, I find it very frustrating that it's been so slow to deploy. Finally, in my neighborhood in San Jose, it's being deployed. And I'm wondering if the deployment of DSL is providing competition. I mean, I'm interested that AOL is now pursuing satellite and wireless opportunities, which I think is a good development. And whether, in your judgment, just as a market analyst, Mr. Jacobs, that has been spurred in part by cable or by DSL, or is it just a good opportunity?
I think AOL is a content provider. They are agnostic relative to what channels they get over. They got to get over every channel. The biggest threat to the company long term is that they get marginalized if they don't have broadband access. DSL is broadband access. Right. The only question is, will it be available to 100% of the market or only the current 40 to 50% that it can technologically address? That's a question of whether the RBOCs invest incrementally. They are now making such announcements that they're about to invest. I think they're going to wind up doing so as long as they're incented to. And the answer, by the way, technologically, if you offered me products, I prefer DSL. It's a private line. All of the bandwidth is yours. It's better technology. It's a better technology in the sense that cable technology is a shared medium. If your next-door neighbor is a bandwidth hog, then you won't be able to download your movies or your websites. So all things being equal, I think DSL is a perfectly good alternative, probably a better one.
The gentlelady from California, Ms. Waters.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members. This is a good hearing, and it forces us to have to get involved and to pay attention and to learn all of the new technologies so that we can be prepared to assist our constituents in whatever way that we can to make sure that there is easy access, affordability, and that they well, basically that they have access and it is affordable and it is comprehensive. I would like Mr. Barr to, again, tell me why there's something wrong with AT&T pursuing its strategy of acquiring cable companies such as Media One, and why does that make them more able to provide services in ways that others can't? And does this not give them the ability to have access in ways that the local telephone companies may not allow them?
AT&T can get access today over the telephone line because the regulatory requirements are that we provide both the line and the bill provides for us providing condition loops to AT&T. There's been a two-step tactic that's been used twice before in this century. One, buy up a lot of local pipelines into the house. Two, get a big footprint, which they're doing now with cable. And then two, adopt a closed system which says that you can only get our services over that system. And they did that in the beginning of this century with telephone, and that's how they monopolized telephone. They said, well, we don't want other people attaching telephones to this line, so you have to use our telephone, and you have to use our long distance, and that's the only way we can get our investment back. Same thing in 1980 with cable. And this time they leveraged their power over the content, and they took control of the content. And there's virtually no independent video programmers around anymore. And these guys now have a stranglehold on it. Then once they get the positions in those markets, they can use it to reinforce their basic primacy over the pipeline. The key point is that, and I think the lesson was learned in the 1996 Act, and repeatedly in trying to deal with cable companies, is you got to require open access at the beginning. If you wait too long, there's an entrenchment and a distortion, and then it takes regulation to get rid of it.
Let me hear from AT&T on that.
Thank you very much, Representative Waters. Apart from the irony of Mr. Barr representing a local telephone monopoly, lecturing us on open markets and competition, I think what you've touched upon is absolutely right. I mean, as Mr. Jacobs pointed out in his testimony, although I'm not sure the colorful rhetoric of AT&T being crushed is exactly the way I would have put it, we have invested an awful lot of money in cable systems. We are a newcomer to the cable business. We see cable not only as a way of distributing video, but as a way of investing in building a brand new communications platform, which everywhere we are successful will be no better than the second kid on the block. We are going to be competing against monopolies who have 99% of the residential business today, companies like GTE and the Bell companies. We don't get our money back if we close our systems or if we turn our back on what consumers want. If AOL is able to get DSL service that gives consumers a choice of ISPs and consumers want that, we would be very, very ill-advised not to make sure consumers can also get what they want from us. We have an incentive to do that. We have an incentive to be open. I think the question today is not whether open or closed or competitive or non-competitive is right. It's do we need more rules and laws to achieve that, or do we have the incentives we need already in place?
Finally, Mr. Jacobs said that you're about to invest in ways that you're not going to be able to recoup your investment. Would you do that?
Well, I guess I would certainly hope we don't, but I think the essence of what he said, at least to my way of looking at it, Representative Waters, is that we are taking a very big risk here. We are taking a very big risk to make this Telecommunications Act promise of competition a reality. No one else is investing the kind of money we are in building the kinds of facilities for residential customers that we are now doing through the cable systems. We are very optimistic about our ability to recover on our investment if you give us a chance to serve customers, but that means giving them what they want, not giving them what we tell them they want.
The gentleman from Florida, Mr. McCullum.
Well, thank you very much. I apologize for missing some of the earlier hearing, but I've been fascinated by the subject matter and have certainly perused a good deal of your testimony this morning, gentlemen. I must say that I'm open-minded about this matter. It is a matter of which both sides of the argument, and maybe there are three sides really, have a lot to say. And being somebody who likes to make the right decision, it makes it more difficult when you have such good and persuasive advocates sitting here making those cases. I have one question that probably, because I was absent, has been touched on briefly before, but I would like to revisit it for my own clarification and maybe ask Mr. Boggs and maybe Mr. Rosenblum to respond to this. And that has to do with Mr. Barr's testimony and the points that he made that I thought were very explicit. And I just would like clarification from your perspective, where he says that many cable companies are compelling their customers to sign up, pay for, and use ISPs if they want to use a cable modem. And if they obtain a cable modem service, they must choose the company's cable company's ISP. He goes on to say that there are three penalties for not doing this. Customers who want to use another ISP, they still have to pay for the cable company's ISP. In other words, they have to pay twice. Second, there's a performance penalty, he says, that traffic of customers who want to reach another ISP travels on the public internet, leading to a lower quality connection rather than on yours. And finally, he says, by making customers go through the cable company's own ISP, they can block competitive products from reaching their customers. I suppose, Mr. Boggs, I should direct that to you first. I only mentioned Mr. Rosenblum because I understand AT&T and Time Warner are kind of together collaborating these days on such matters, and I would like to know what your response is to what Mr. Barr has said. He said it very succinctly, and I don't know how succinct the answer's been to that.
Well, I think it's a confused picture of what it is that Time Warner Cable has built in the communities, including throughout Florida, where we have built a high-powered, high-speed network to serve the customers throughout the communities in which we have franchises. This network permits our customers, through the application of servers and interconnection facilities, to get onto the internet. It is, in some ways, an ISP itself. It also has local content that is provided by the cable company and by other local institutions, museums, schools, and others. If a individual is a customer of Time Warner Cable and subscribes to the extra service called Roadrunner, they may get access to anywhere in the network that they choose. If some other ISP or some other information provider, for example, Bloomberg News or some other site on the internet, chooses to permit that customer to get access to them for free, the customer enjoys that access. If that third party chooses to charge them for that access, that's a choice that the customer can make with regard to that provider. It is not a choice that we have made to charge someone twice for something. We are charging them what we think is a fair price. By the way, it's usually about $40 in the marketplace. It varies somewhat from market to market, and it is a service that customers throng to when we roll it out in the community. We are now feeling some stiff competition from DSL. As Mrs. Loughman said, it's a challenging new service, but we are not in the position of charging people twice for anything.
Mr. Barr, do you want to respond in some way to that before my time runs out here?
Right. They're trying to confuse a site that you might go to, like Yahoo, versus an ISP. An ISP performs two functions. One, it's the intermediary that connects you to the backbone and helps you navigate over the internet. And second, it provides you with content, some of its own content, but then it organizes other content. That's what an ISP is, like Mindspring, AOL, GTE.net. What they've done is say, if you want to buy high bandwidth, you must pay the cost of our ISP at home. If you want to get to another ISP, forget this Yahoo nonsense, they're not an ISP. If you want to get to an ISP like GTE.net or AOL, you have to pay twice for their service. It's a double payment.
When I get asked, Mr. Boggs, is that accurate? Do you dispute the characterization Mr. Barr has just given that?
No, I don't think it's accurate. I think the character... In the provision of internet services, there are lots of different services that are offered to a customer. There are many that are hybrid services that are, in fact, have some ISP functions as well as having some content functions. And customers are free to choose them using our network in any way that they wish. To the extent that he says we're forcing, people choose to become our customer, they're buying our service, they choose to make that purchase, that subscription, they are then free to make any other subscriptions that they wish to. If they choose not to buy our service and choose to subscribe to some other service, that's their choice. And they're making that choice every day of the week.
The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Meehan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit the unanimous consent to submit a full statement to the record.
Without objection.
I want to comment on two of the provisions that we're discussing today. The first is allowing the regional bell companies to make long-distance data transfers. And the second is forcing the unbundling of the broadband cable lines. Obviously, these provisions have broad public policy implications. It seems to me I support allowing the regional bell companies to compete in the long-distance data market. Permitting the regional bells the ability to compete in data seems to me is going to spur investment in high-speed digital subscriber line technology, and the companies are going to have incentives to upgrade their networks. Consumers will benefit by receiving faster internet service through a greater choice of providers. With regard to the open cable access provision, my concerns here, at least in comparing them with the benefits of the bill, at least in the short term, are we have to develop a regulatory framework that encourages investment and innovation. And at this point, the cable companies have invested millions of dollars providing cable service to their customers. And if we unbundle the network, what does that mean for the short term? It seems to be premature at this point. And we have to look at this as how do we address these two provisions of the bill with a focus on how to best serve the consumer. Consumers obviously are going to benefit by creating incentives for the regional bell companies and incentives for the cable industry to continue deploying better and faster technologies. With all of this in mind, the number of mergers and investments in the telecommunications industry obviously are unparalleled in today's marketplace. Consumers in Massachusetts, for example, are impacted by the merger of Bell Atlantic and GTE and by AT&T's pending purchase of Media One. Mr. Barr, on behalf of GTE and Mr. Rosenblum on behalf of AT&T, could you please comment on the impact of these transactions? And I'd also like to hear from Mr. Kevelman's response on behalf of the consumers.
You're talking about these major mergers?
Yeah, the mergers, at least as they affect Massachusetts and other states.
Right. I think that the whole logic of the Telecom Act really was to promote some degree of consolidation, because if you tear away geographical restrictions and product line restrictions that have existed in the past, remember we sort of had a siloed telecom industry. Everyone was sort of operated within their own little silo. And the Telecom Act basically wants everyone mixing it up. And therefore, it's very logical that the most efficient way economically for companies to expand their geographic footprint and to expand their product line are through consolidations. That is the most efficient way that brings consumer benefits. The problem will occur where mergers tend to bring together competing entities, existing competitors, and therefore diminish competition in some markets. But I wouldn't say generally that all mergers are bad, and you have to look at each merger as they come to see what its competitive impact is.
Mr. Rosenblum.
Thank you, Congressman. I guess because we don't really favor any presumptions under antitrust laws, we also, like Mr. Barr, think mergers have to be viewed on their individual merits. And some are necessary, some may not be. I think, though, the two kinds of mergers you've raised are very different in terms of their impact on customers. In the case of GTE and Bell Atlantic, or Bell Atlantic and 9X before it, or Ameritech and SBC just in the news now, I think we're disappointed, at least, because I think the purpose of the Telecom Act was to stimulate competition between firms that had not traditionally competed with one another. And in the case of local companies that merge, I think you see companies merging instead of competing with each other when they could have been competing. Our merger and investment in the cable industry is designed to promote exactly, I think, the kind of competition the Telecom Act envisioned. We are not only using the investment to compete over facilities with the incumbent monopolies, but I'd like to think that our participation in cable is turning the cable industry and the telephone industry finally to face each other as competitors.
The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Delahunt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. All the questions I had have been asked, and I think Mr. Kimmelman, you wanted an opportunity to respond to my friend Mr. Meehan's question.
Thank you, Mr. Delahunt. I was on a roll with Mr. Barr. This one I have to disagree with him on. I think every murder obviously should be judged on its own merits, but I think both of these are devastating. I think we're losing potential competitors, as Mr. Rosenblum points out. But unfortunately, I think the AT&T transaction, while well-intentioned on the telephone side, can have devastating effects for rising cable rates and rising high-speed internet access charges. We're just losing potential competitors through this consolidation. Back to your original point, though, Mr. Meehan, I think you raise, if we were in a markup setting and not in a context of a hearing, I would suggest that you can phase in obligations. Ms. Lofgren indicated some ideas related to sending clear signals to investors. Really, for both of the provisions that you're talking about, I think there is a problem, as Mr. Salisbury has pointed out, with, in the future, segregating data from voice. Everything is being digitized. Nothing is going to be purely one or the other. It's an enormous problem in having separate policy rules for something that can't be separated easily and policed. So I'd suggest that you can deal with both of those provisions through transitions. And while there are a lot of people I like to shock, one of the last people in the world I like to shock is Mr. Conyers, but I have to explain that the purpose of whether it's the 96 Act or overall policy here, was always to promote competition for greater choice and lower prices for consumers. We're 3.5 years into a law with cable prices soaring, $5 billion in new telephone charges because of poor antitrust enforcement, horrible regulatory policy at the federal level. We need to do something here. So whether it's phasing in some provisions, working them more carefully. We certainly have problems with some of the provisions in this bill. We do believe it's time to move. There is a lot of question about where these markets move. The fact that data becomes the dominant driving force is interesting, but the fact that people who make less than 30 minutes of long-distance calls today, according to the FCC, are paying twice what they were 2 years ago for those 30 minutes is outrageous. And we have to do something to make sure we're not giving away all the reasonable prices and affordability of our old system as we try to grow that into a competitive internet. So we just urge you to step in and put a lid on some of the things that are going wrong in terms of price.
Thank you, Mr. Kimmelman, and I'll yield to the gentle lady from California. I do have one question now, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, no, go. Take your question.
No, you know, and I find your analysis interesting because, as you say, those who use less than 30 minutes of long-distance time are now paying double, which indicates that the burden has shifted in terms of those least able, presumably, to pay, and the market has become so much more attractive. All these gentlemen here today, clearly interested in the fastest growing, most lucrative market, which is the transmission of data. I think for those of us who are in a policy-making role here, we ought to reflect and contemplate on that. I just have one quick question for Mr. Jacobs. Let me just make an observation. I'm really interested to see what happens to the market today after your analysis is broadcast on C-SPAN and all over America. It'll be interesting to see how AT&T does. In any event,
do I respond to that?
in any event, you made an interesting point about UNDEEP. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but litigation had commenced. Can you tell us what happened to that litigation, or did the market realities and the aggressiveness of some of the players outpace the litigation in terms of changing the status quo or making move? Because I guess my answer is, if we rely on the enforcement of antitrust provisions, we're talking about an extremely
Does the
slow...
gentleman require additional time?
If I could have an additional moment.
An additional moment.
A chairman's moment, Mr. Hywood.
I have been very strict with everybody up until now, and I don't want to incur their wrath, but if they, if unanimous consent is requested for another minute, why, they have a chance to object, and they haven't, so the gentleman has another minute.
Thank you, Mr. Hyde. In any event, if you could just describe the litigation and the changing market conditions and draw a parallel for us in terms of whether this is an efficient mechanism, i.e. litigation through the courts with appeals, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you.
Litigation has been a fairly disastrous set of events for the industry. It has wildly delayed the onset of competition. UniP was attempted by the FCC as the primary way of getting long-distance companies into the market. The RBOX objected to it. They did the fair thing. They went to court. They had it overturned. That created effectively a 2.5-year truce until the Supreme Court ruled on it. The Supreme Court ruled recently, and now the components of that issue have been thrown back to the FCC. We haven't yet heard their ruling, so we don't really know the fate of UniP. The one place that UniP has come up is when RBOX have decided that they're ready to get into long distance or eager to get in, such as the case in Texas and the case in New York. They have struck separate deals with their state public utility commissions to offer up UniP for limited periods of time for specific numbers of customers at these high discounted rates as the way of getting into long distance. So UniP is basically sort of a piecemeal issue right now. The RBOX have not embraced it wholeheartedly, but they are using it to get into specific states into long distance.
The gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Rothman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to associate myself with Ms. Lofgren's comments. I thought they were right on the money. The question for me is, when does something become an essential facility? And who bears the burden of proving that? This may come as an odd thing for a Democrat to say, but people have described me as an odd Democrat and worse. But why shouldn't the presumption be that this is not an essential facility yet, if it has not yet reached 1% of the market? And if 1% is the right number, when DSL and wireless achieve 1%, are we going to declare them essential facilities also? Is that going to be good for America? I'm always tickled here in the House of Representatives by people who constantly rail against big government when it has to do with health care or food for poor people or public education or cleaning up the environment or, God forbid, gun control or gun safety. The big hand of government is terrible. But when it comes to benefiting their industry or their constituents, big government intervention is the right thing to do. So, but I still think the presumption has got to be against calling this an essential facility, certainly at 1%. And again, it may be an odd thing for a Democrat to say, but I'm thrilled that the cable investors have invested all of their billions of dollars to create a system now that everybody wants to jump in on, because it's going to provide consumers with so many options and opportunities, and same with DSL and wireless. Will it encourage other entrepreneurs, capitalists, to expand beyond cable, DSL, and wireless to some unknown technology that we can't even yet contemplate if we at 1% of the market declare cable to be an essential facility? I think it might. And I have a question for the gentleman from Portland. If the cable people have to take on these other folks, you know, they pay franchise fees to the cities. Will that make them no longer cable companies? Should they not pay their franchise fees? Or should we require the providers of these broadband services now, the phone companies, satellite and wireless, to pay franchise fees too? Or do we remove all the franchise fees altogether?
Well, thank you, Congressman. I address your first question quickly from a local perspective. A small government, not big government in Portland, Oregon. From our point of view, I don't see how we could come to any conclusion except that these are essential. We, for many, many years, have franchised cable facilities because our citizens don't want 10 cable lines on the streets. We have one set of streets and they want one cable line. Up until this year, we've had two competing companies which both had a franchise, geographic monopolies, TCI and Paragon. But by having two, we were able to work with both to see what would one company do for citizens, what would another not do, and we're able to negotiate over time good franchise.
Reclaiming my time, did you get to the point where you know when you'd want to make wireless and DSL essential facilities? Have you figured that out?
Well, wireless is a new one for local governments. On your franchise fee question, if I could just finish up quickly on the last point, we now have one company that owns all of the cable systems in Portland. We have one opportunity as a local government to say what we believe should happen. We're laboring under an assumption that there is no federal policy. Local governments have the authority to exert open access requirements, and we have.
I'm just going to reclaim my time. I probably have 10 seconds, just to say that for me, the burden of proof would be on those who at 1% feel this is an essential facility, and to prove why this would not have a chilling effect on those who want to create new technologies and make the money the cable folks are presumably going to make now if they discover some other way to transmit data beyond those that we can think
well,
of
quickly,
today.
I don't mean to take all your time. I mean to answer the question. 100% of the cable system is not 1%. In Portland, Oregon, it's 100%. That's what we're dealing with. We charge a franchise fee on whoever uses the right-of-way. A wireless does not use the right-of-way.
So you wouldn't give up the franchise fee for cable. Does anyone else have a comment? Mr. Jacobs, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I quite agree that to call something an essential facility when it has 1% is sort of a misnomer. Secondly, as I understand an essential facility, it's when you don't have an alternative, not just a question of how much market share it has. DSL is an alternative, and there are many new alternatives coming onto the market. MCI WorldCom has, over the last couple of months, along with Sprint, invested very dramatically in a technology called MMDS. It's a wireless technology. That's a function of chasing the exact same return on investment that cable is chasing and that the RBOCs are chasing.
I'm sorry, Mr. Cleland wants a minute.
If I could most respectfully challenge the 1% assumption. That's assuming that this is just one internet market. A video ISP is very different than a narrowband telco ISP because they offer completely different products. Over a narrowband dial-up, which is the 30 million telephone users, you can't pull down TV programming. You can't pull down the Titanic. You can't pull down these multimedia or video things. It just isn't allowed. I mean, it isn't possible. And so of the market, of the video ISP marketplace, cable has a 90% share of that very different market than the telco market.
The gentleman's time has expired. All time has expired. I want to congratulate this panel for your staying here and for your illumination of a very complicated issue. You may wish to ask, are we going to mark this bill up? I have no answer for that. I don't say yes or no. I say we're going to assimilate all that you have told us today and think about it and talk about it, and decisions will be made. But there's nothing imminent, so your anxiety quotient can diminish.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Mr.
Could I add my compliments to this very distinguished panel? Their staying power is enormous, and I'm very grateful.
And the quality of their testimony was
pretty good, too.
Very lofty. Thank you. The committee stands adjourned.